Hello, my friend, come in and let the door swing shut behind you. Wherever you are right now, whatever kind of day this has been, you can set it down at the door. It will still be there in the morning. It always is. Tonight I want to take you somewhere quiet. A small house in the English countryside surrounded by water on a morning nobody thought was important. There is a woman whose face you could pick out of a crowd of 1,000. Her name has survived 500 years, 6 films, a dozen television series, and more arguments than almost any other woman in English history. And yet, nobody alive can tell you what year she was born. Not her family, not her enemies, not even the men who signed her death warrant. Somewhere in England, in a cold house beside a moat, a girl was born whose name would one day split a church in half. And nobody bothered to write down the date, so that is where we begin. Not with a crown, with a missing number. Before we cross that bridge together, may I ask you something small? If the stories I bring here have ever helped you sleep a little easier, then a subscribe or a share does more for this quiet corner of the internet than you would believe. But only if you mean it. I would rather have one honest comment than 1,000 polite ones. And speaking of comments, tell me where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. I ask every time and the answers still delight me. Somebody is folding laundry in Ohio. Somebody's finishing a night shift in Manchester. Somebody's lying in the dark in Sydney with the window open. I like knowing we're all inside the same story at the same moment. Now, turn the lights down until they're almost gone. Switch the fan on for that soft, steady sound. Let your shoulders drop about an inch, and let us walk back 500 years. Picture a morning in Kent in the south of England. The sky has not decided yet whether it is going to be day. Everything is the colour of skimmed milk. There's a low mist sitting on the surface of a moat, and the water underneath is black and perfectly still the way water only ever is before people wake up. On the far side of that water there is a house, not a palace. Not a fortress on a hill with banners snapping in the cold air. A modest square, stubborn little building of red brick and grey stone, with a gatehouse in the middle and a wooden drawbridge that has to be lowered by hand every single morning by a man who is thoroughly tired of doing it. This is Hever Castle, and if you have ever seen it in a film, I promise you it was wearing makeup. On screen, Hever tends to appear as a fairy tale. Tall towers, sweeping halls, candlelight bouncing off polished marble. In reality, it was a fortified farmhouse with ambitions. The rooms were small, the ceilings were low. In winter, the damp came up through the stone and settled into the blankets, into the wool, into your bones, and stayed there until roughly the middle of May. The moat was not romantic either. It was security and it was drainage, and in August it smelled like it. But here is the thing about that house. It was bought with money, not inherited, not granted by a king for bravery on a battlefield, bought. In the year 1462 with cash by a man named Geoffrey Boleyn, and Geoffrey Boleyn sold cloth. I want you to sit with that for a moment, because it is the single most important fact in this entire story and almost nobody mentions it. The most famous queen consort in English history came from a family of merchants. Geoffrey was a mercer. He dealt in fine fabrics, silks and linens in the crowded, shouting, filthy, magnificent streets of London. He was very good at it. So good that he became an alderman and then sheriff, and then in the year 1457, Lord Mayor of London. He made a fortune out of other people wanting to look expensive. And then he did what people with new money have done in every century since. He bought land. He bought a manor in Norfolk called Blickling. He bought Hever in Kent. He married a nobleman's daughter. And he began quietly and deliberately the long project of turning a merchant family into a noble one. 3 generations later, his great-granddaughter would be crowned Queen of England. 3 years after that, she would be dead. I find something almost unbearably human in that. This was a family climbing a ladder. And nobody climbing a ladder ever looks up and thinks about how far the fall is. And I should tell you that Hever may not even be where she took her first breath. The family owned that other manor in Norfolk, Blickling. Flat country up there, wide skies. Big weather rolling in off the North Sea with nothing in the way to slow it down. For years the tradition has held that Anne was born at Blickling, and that the family moved south to Hever while she was still small. The evidence is thin. A note by a man writing 100 years later. A local memory passed along the way. Local memories are gathering confidence with every retelling. So we have a woman with no birthday, and 2 possible birthplaces, and a family that had spent 3 generations trying to make itself look older and grander than it truly was. Which tells you something, I think, about how history actually works. It does not preserve the important things. It preserves the things somebody happened to write down. Now, about that missing date. We do not know when Anne Boleyn was born. We do not know the day, we do not know the month. And the historians cannot agree on the year, which sounds like a small thing, and is actually enormous, as you will see. Why would nobody write it down? Because in England, at the start of the 1500s, there was no law requiring anyone to record a birth. There were no birth certificates, no registries, no forms. A baby arrived, and if the family cared, somebody might scratch a note in the family Bible or a book of prayers. If nobody scratched the note, the date simply evaporated, and here is the part that always stops me. The law that finally required English parishes to write down every baptism, every marriage, every burial was introduced in the year 1538. Anne Boleyn died in 1536. She missed it by 2 years, and the religious reform that produced that law was pushed forward by the very movement she had spent her adult life protecting. She helped build the filing cabinet. She just never made it inside, so the historians have been left to argue. And they have been arguing for about 200 years now, politely in footnotes, which is how historians throw punches. There are 2 camps. The first camp says 1501. Their strongest piece of evidence is a letter, a real one. It still survives, and I want to tell you about it properly later, because it is the only place in the world where you can hear this girl's own voice as a child. She wrote it in French from a palace in what is now Belgium, to her father back in England. The handwriting is careful, the spelling is a disaster. And the argument goes like this: a girl who can hold a quill, form her letters, and construct a sentence in a second language no matter how badly, is probably around 12 or 13, not 6. There is a second, colder piece of evidence for that camp. We know the girls who served in that particular household were normally taken at around 12 to 14 years old. It was not a nursery, it was a finishing school for the daughters of Europe. A 6-year-old would have been an extraordinary exception. Now the second camp, they say 1507. They point to a note in the margin of a book by a later historian, giving that year outright. They point to a woman named Jane Dormer who knew people who had known Anne, and who insisted she was not quite 29 when she died, which lands you neatly in 1507. And they point to the letters her own family wrote, in which her father and the woman who took her in both describe her as strikingly unusually young. Her father called her the little Boleyn. The woman who took her in wrote that she found the child so bright and so pleasant for her tender age, that she felt more in debt to him for sending her than he was to her for taking her. You do not write that sentence about a normal 13-year-old. You write it about a very small person who has surprised you. So which is it? I will be honest with you, I lean towards the earlier date. The letter for me settles it, but I want to be careful here, because this is exactly the kind of gap where people stop doing history and start doing wishful thinking. And besides, the argument itself is not really the interesting part. Think about what those 2 numbers actually mean. If she was born in 1501, then when her father shipped her overseas to be educated among strangers, she was a girl of 12, old enough to understand the arrangement, old enough to be frightened and to hide it. If she was born in 1507, she was 6 years old. 6. Put a 6-year-old, into a boat, send her to another country, hand her to a woman she has never met, and tell her that from now on she will speak a language she does not know. That is not a footnote. That is a completely different childhood, and I think this is why the missing date matters more than it looks. It means that when we talk about Anne Boleyn, we are always guessing at how old she was when things happened to her. We do not know how old she was when she left home. We do not know how old she was when a king first turned and looked at her. History gave her a face, a temper, a scandal, and a legend. It did not give her an age. There is one last thing I want to show you before we go upstairs in that house. At Hever there is a small book, a book of hours which was the ordinary prayer book of a well-off Christian in those years. Beautiful portable, handled every day until the corners went soft. And in the margin of that book, in a neat sloping hand, somebody wrote 4 words in French, Le temps viendra, the time will come. Underneath it, a small drawing of an armillary sphere, a model of the heavens, a device for measuring time in the movement of the stars, and a signature, not a royal one, no title, no flourish, no crown, just Anne Boleyn. Now I have to be fair with you. We cannot date that inscription with any certainty. She may have written it as a young woman. She may have written it later. Historians disagree, which by now will not surprise you at all. But I cannot look at those 4 words without feeling something turn over in my chest, because whoever wrote them was waiting. She had looked at her own life and at the small damp house, and at the water going round it, and she had decided that this was not the end of the sentence. The time will come. She was right. That is the terrible part. She was not Anne Boleyn yet. Not the queen, not the villain, not the martyr. Not the woman on a scaffold with a French swordsman standing behind her and half of London watching. She was a girl in a cold house beside still water, learning what girls were taught to learn. But that little house did not shape her on its own, because inside those low rooms were 2 people pulling in completely opposite directions. Her mother carried the blood of the proudest, oldest, most dangerous family in England. Her father carried something rarer and sharper than blood, and he had already worked out exactly what his daughters were worth on the open market. One of them gave Anne her name, the other gave her the fate that went with it. So stay here with me. We're about to walk upstairs and meet the 2 people who made her. Let us step back a little further now, to a time before Anne existed at all, because to understand the child you first have to understand the bargain that made her possible. In the spring of 1536, when his world was quietly falling apart around him, Thomas Boleyn sat down to write a letter to Thomas Cromwell. He was almost 60. He had been an ambassador, an earl, the father of a queen, and he was writing to a man who now held his future in one hand. And in the middle of that letter he says something so plain, so unguarded, that it has stayed with me for years. He says that when he married he had only £50 a year to keep himself and his wife, for as long as his own father was still alive. And then he adds, almost as an afterthought, that she brought him every year a child, £50, and a baby every 12 months. There it is. The whole engine of this story in a single tired sentence written by an old man trying to save himself. Now £50 a year was not poverty. Let us be fair to him. A skilled craftsman in London might hope for £6 or £7 a year if the work was steady. £50 put the young Boleyns comfortably inside the gentry with servants and a good table and horses in the stable. But a duke could count on several thousand, and that gap, that enormous quiet gap between comfortable and powerful, is the space in which Anne Boleyn was conceived and born and raised and eventually spent. So let us meet the 2 people who made that bargain, not as villains, not as saints, as 2 ambitious young people in the last years of the 15th century who looked at each other across a marriage contract and each saw something the other one needed. Her name was Elizabeth Howard, and I want to be careful here because most tellings of this story get her completely backwards. You will often hear it framed as a simple transaction. The rising merchant family buys itself a bride with noble blood. The Boleyns purchase respectability. The trouble with that version is the timing. Think about when this marriage was arranged. Around 1498. Now cast your mind back 13 years before that to a muddy field in Leicestershire, in the summer of 1485. Bosworth. The Howards backed the losing king. John Howard, the first Duke of Norfolk, was killed there fighting for Richard III. His son Thomas Howard was found injured on the field and dragged off to the Tower of London, where he stayed for more than 3 years. The dukedom was gone. The lands were gone. The family name was for a while almost worthless. So when Elizabeth Howard was growing up, she was not a princess in a golden tower. She was the daughter of a prisoner. She was the child of a family that had gambled everything on one afternoon and lost, which changes the whole shape of the marriage, does it not? This was not a merchant buying a noblewoman. This was 2 families both climbing out of a hole, deciding to climb together. The Howards had a name that still meant something in the north and the east of England and nothing else. The Boleyns had money land in Norfolk and in Kent, and a young man who was very, very good at his job. Both sides brought something. Both sides took a risk. And I find that far more interesting than the fairy tale version. It means Anne Boleyn was not born into a rival. She was born into recovery. Now let us talk about her father, because he's been badly served by 4 centuries of storytelling. If you have seen the films, you know the character. The cold, calculating father, the man who pushes his daughters toward the king like a merchant pushing goods across a counter. The schemer in the shadows. I think that portrait is lazy, and I think the real man is far more compelling. Thomas Boleyn was by a comfortable margin one of the most gifted diplomats of his generation in England. He spoke French so well that he could conduct serious negotiations without an interpreter standing at his elbow, which at that court was almost a superpower. Most English noblemen of his rank could manage a few polite phrases and then had to hand the conversation to a professional. He could hold the room himself. He also had Latin, and he had it well enough that Erasmus, the greatest scholar in Europe, dedicated works to him. Erasmus did not scatter dedications around like sweets at a fair. He gave them to people whose opinion he wanted, or whose money he needed, or whose mind he respected. And Thomas Boleyn was not some pale bookish figure either. He was a serious athlete. He jousted, he hunted. He was quick and charming and physically brave, and he had fought against the Cornish rebels at Blackheath as a young man and been knighted for it. Put all of that together and you get something rare. A man who could ride into the lists in the morning, argue treaty terms in French over dinner, and discuss theology in Latin before bed. Here is my honest view of him. Thomas Boleyn was not a monster. He was a professional. He lived in a world where a family's fortune had to be rebuilt in a single generation, or lost forever, and he had exactly one set of tools available to him. Skill, charm, and children. Was he ruthless? Yes. Was he unusual in being ruthless? Absolutely not. Every ambitious father in Europe was doing the same arithmetic. The difference is that his arithmetic worked, and worked so spectacularly, and then ended so terribly that we've spent 500 years staring at him. But I will say this, and I want to say it carefully because it matters later. There is a difference between a father who advances his children and a father who spends them. And the tragedy of Thomas Boleyn is that by the end even he could not tell you exactly where that line had been. Now, the nursery. Come back to that phrase for a moment. She brought me every year a child. We know the names of 3 of those children: Mary, Anne, George. Those are the 3 who lived long enough to have lives we can follow. But there were others. There is a small brass memorial in the church at Hever, and another in the chapel at Penshurst marking Boleyn children who did not survive. A brother named Thomas, a brother named Henry, little plates of engraved metal set into stone for infants who never got a story. And this is one of those historical facts that people skate past, and I do not think we should. Anne Boleyn grew up in a house where babies arrived and babies died, where her mother was pregnant again and again through her 20s, where the nursery was a place of constant arrival and occasional silence, Roughly 1 child in 5 did not reach their first birthday in that world. Among those who did, a great many were gone before they were 10. Plague came through in waves. The sweating sickness arrived out of nowhere and could kill a healthy adult between breakfast and supper. So when we picture the Boleyn children, let us not picture 3 tidy siblings in a portrait. Let us picture 3 survivors, 3 children who had already learned before they could properly write their own names that the world takes people away without warning and does not explain itself. I have often wondered what that does to a person, whether it makes you fragile or whether it makes you very, very hard to frighten. Look at what those 3 became, and I think you can make a decent guess. So who were they in the pecking order of that household? Mary was almost certainly the eldest. The evidence is not a birth register, because there is no birth register, but it is good evidence all the same. Mary married first in 1520, and decades later, when her grandson was fighting for a family title, his case rested on the claim that his grandmother had been the elder daughter. A family arguing about an inheritance has every reason to get that particular detail right. George came last born around 1503 or 1504, the only surviving son, the one who would carry the name, which leaves Anne in the middle. And I want you to sit with that for a second, because I think it is one of the most underrated facts of her entire life. She was not the pretty eldest daughter whose marriage had already been sketched out. She was not the precious only son whose education was the family investment. She was the second girl, the spare, and in a family like that, the second girl has to do something rather remarkable in order to be seen at all. Tell me honestly, if you were watching that nursery in the year 1510, which of those 3 children would you have bet on? Because I promise you, nobody was betting on Anne. Now let me give her mother back to her for a moment, because Elizabeth Howard has been flattened into a shadow and she deserves better. We tend to imagine her as absent, distant, a cold Tudor mother who handed her children to servants and went back to her embroidery. That picture comes from nowhere. It is invention. What we actually know is that Elizabeth Howard was a court woman. She served the Queen. She took part in the great palace entertainments dressed in cloth of gold, dancing in front of the king. She was in the room where things happened, and she was celebrated for her beauty in print, which was no small thing in that century. The poet John Skelton wrote verses in her honour, comparing her to the great beauties of legend, praising her grace and her bearing. Those verses were published. People at court would have known them. So picture the girl now. Picture a small, dark-eyed second daughter growing up with the knowledge that her mother is admired in poems and that her grandfather is being rehabilitated into the highest ranks of the kingdom, and that her father can walk into any court in Europe and be understood. That is not a household that teaches you to be quiet. That is a household that teaches you that being noticed is the family trade. And the rehabilitation, when it came like a thunderclap. On the 9th of September 1513, at a place called Flodden in the cold hills near the Scottish border, Anne's grandfather Thomas Howard destroyed a Scottish army and killed a Scottish king in the process. It was the most complete English victory in a generation. The family that had been ruined at Bosworth was restored. The dukedom came back. Thomas Howard became Duke of Norfolk again in 1514, and the Howards were suddenly once more the first family of England. Anne was abroad by then. She missed the celebrations entirely. But somewhere in the Low Countries a letter would have reached her telling her that her mother's family had climbed all the way back out of the pit. And I think we underestimate what that news does to a child's sense of what is possible. She grew up inside a living demonstration that a family can be destroyed and still return, that disgrace is not always permanent, that the wheel turns. Hold on to that thought. It explains a great deal about how she behaved when her own turn came. Before we go on, let me deal with a rumour, because it follows this family everywhere and it deserves a straight answer. There has long been a whisper that the king had once taken a personal interest in Anne's mother. It was thrown around by enemies of the family as gossip usually is at exactly the moment when hurting the Boleyns was politically useful. And here is the thing that almost nobody mentions. Henry VIII was asked about it directly to his face by a member of his own parliament, and he denied it flatly. Never with the mother, he said. His chief minister, standing right there, added a denial of his own on a related point. Now Henry VIII was capable of many things, but quietly declining to boast was not usually one of them. When he was pressed on this, he shut it down, and I think a straightforward denial from the one man who would actually know is worth rather more than a rumour repeated by people who wanted the Boleyns destroyed. So let us set it aside and let us be a little suspicious in general about stories that appear only after a woman has become inconvenient. Which brings me to the thing I most want you to take from all of this. We look at the Boleyn family and we see a conspiracy, a machine. Parents plotting over candlelight about how to place their daughters. I think the truth is quieter and sadder than that. I think they loved their children. I think Elizabeth Howard held those babies and grieved the ones she buried. I think Thomas Boleyn was proud of his clever middle daughter in the ordinary way that fathers are proud. And I think at the same time, entirely without contradiction, that both of them looked at her and saw an asset. Those two things could sit side by side in the 16th century without anybody feeling the slightest discomfort. A child was someone you loved and someone you invested. A daughter was a person and a placement. That is not cruelty. That is the water they swam in. But imagine growing up inside it. Imagine being small and being watched and slowly working out that the affection in the room is real, and that it is also being measured. I suspect that is where Anne Boleyn's famous watchfulness was born. Not in France, not at court. At home, in a warm room with people who loved her, and who were also gently and constantly assessing her, which is exactly where we're going next. Because so far we have talked about this family from the outside the way a historian does. The letters, the titles, the marriage, contracts, the memorial brasses. Now let us do something harder. Let us go inside. Let us push open a heavy door on an ordinary winter morning in Kent when nobody important is visiting and nothing historic is happening, and find out what it actually felt like to be a small girl waking up in that house in the cold before the sun came up. Because the truth is, most of her childhood was not made of politics at all. It was made of bread and prayers and needlework and boredom. And boredom, as we are about to see, may have been the most dangerous thing in the building. So, we have met the two people who made her. Now let us meet the house that raised her, from the inside, on an ordinary day that nobody at the time thought was worth writing down. And I should warn you, almost none of this is going to look like the films. Our girl is about to be woken up by a bell she cannot see in a room where she can watch her own breath rise towards the ceiling. She will be dressed by another person because she cannot possibly manage it alone. She will eat her largest meal of the day at 11 o'clock in the morning, and she will be in bed in the dark before most of us have finished our evening. This is what her childhood actually felt like, hour by hour. Let us begin before she opens her eyes. The house wakes from the bottom upwards. Somewhere below, in a kitchen with a floor of beaten earth, a servant is on her knees raking last night's ashes out of a hearth that never fully goes out. Fire is not a convenience in this world. Fire is currency. Letting it die completely means half an hour of striking flint and coaxing and swearing under your breath, and everybody upstairs waiting for their food. Then the dairy, then the buttery, then bread, because bread is not something you buy, it is something the house makes every single day, in quantities that would frighten a modern kitchen. And upstairs, in a small chamber with a low ceiling, a child is still asleep under a mound of wool and fur in a bed she almost certainly shares. That is the first thing to understand, and it is the thing that surprises people most. She was never alone, not once. Not for a single hour of her childhood. There is no such thing as a private bedroom in this house. Children share beds with siblings. Servants sleep on trundles and pallets on the floor beside their charges. Somebody is always within arm's reach, breathing in the dark. We tend to imagine solitude as the natural human condition and company as the interruption. For her, it was the exact opposite. Being alone would have felt strange and slightly alarming and possibly like a punishment, which makes me wonder about something. When she was older and every eye in England was fixed on her, I doubt she ever thought of it as an invasion. She'd been watched since the day she was born. It was simply the temperature of the water she swam in. Now the cold. I know we all say old houses were cold. I want to be more specific than that, because specific is what makes it real. Heather sat in the middle of a moat. Water on 4 sides all year round. That water pushed damp into the stone, and the stone pushed it into the plaster, and the plaster passed it along to the linen and the wool, and the small human being wrapped inside them. Windows had shutters, and in the better rooms glass. Glass was expensive enough that in some houses it was taken out and packed away when the family travelled. There were tapestries and hangings on the walls, and we look at those in museums now and admire the artistry and completely miss the point. They were insulation. Beautiful, staggeringly expensive insulation. In the winter months, the cold air came in under the doors and along the floors, and you did not fight it. You dressed for it indoors. Which brings me to the clothes. And here is where I think the past gets truly strange in the best way. She was pinned into her clothing. Buttons existed and hooks existed, but a great deal of a well-born woman's outfit was fastened with straight pins. Dozens of them. Sleeves pinned to bodices, sheer coverings pinned into place. A whole architecture held together by small sharp objects and the steady hands of somebody else. Pins were bought by the thousand. There's a reason the phrase pin money ended up in the English language. And underneath everything, next to the skin, there was the smock. Plain white linen. That was the layer that mattered. Because here is a fact I love telling people, and I want you to keep it in mind the next time you see a gorgeous Tudor gown on screen. They did not wash the gowns. Wool, velvet, silk brocade embroidered in silver thread and lined with fur. You cannot put that in a tub. It would be ruined, and it cost more than a labourer earned in 3 years. So instead they washed the linen, the smock, the shift, the collars and cuffs and caps. That is why so much white shows at the throat and the wrists in the portraits of that century. It is not decoration. It is a statement. It says this household has enough linen and enough soap and enough hands to boil it and beat it and dry it on a hedge. Cleanliness was something you displayed at the edges. Tell me honestly, had you ever heard that before? I remember the moment somebody explained it to me and I had to sit down and rearrange every costume drama I had ever watched. So, she is dressed. It is somewhere around 6 in the morning. Before anything goes into her stomach, something goes into her soul. Prayers first, always. A household of this rank kept its own chapel, and the day opened there in the half-light with the same words said in the same order in every gentry house in England. Then breakfast, which was small and unceremonious. Bread, perhaps a little cold meat. And ale? Yes, ale. Weak, cloudy, low in strength, brewed in the house and drunk by everybody, including the children. This was not some Tudor moral failing. Ale was food. It carried calories it kept for days, and the brewing made it safer than whatever was sitting in the ditch outside. People did drink water. I want to be fair about that because the internet has flattened this into a myth. They drank from clean springs and they cooked with water. But at the table in a house like this one, you were given ale, and you thought nothing of it. The morning belonged to work. The schoolroom took a share of it, and we will get to what was in that schoolroom shortly, because it deserves proper attention. But a great deal of a gentlewoman's education happened on her feet following her mother through the house. This still room where fruit was preserved and medicines were mixed from herbs grown 20 steps away. The linen store counted and recorded like treasure because it was treasure. The kitchen accounts, the dairy, the brew house, the management of perhaps 30 or 40 servants each with a rank and a grievance. A great house was a small business with a chapel attached, and the woman at the top of it was the chief executive, whatever the law said about her being subject to her husband. That is the training nobody puts in the films. Long before Anne Boleyn learned how to hold a room at a royal court, she watched a woman hold a household. Budgets, personnel, supply chains, politics between the pantry and the stables, I've come to think that mattered more than we credit. Now, 11 o'clock in the morning, dinner. Not lunch, dinner. The main meal of the day in the middle of the day when the light was best and the fire had been going for 6 hours. Pottage thickened with oats and vegetables. Bread of several qualities, the whitest reserved for the family. Roasted meat if the day allowed it. Butter, cheese. Fruit from the orchard usually cooked because raw fruit was suspected of causing illness. Vegetables were there and plentiful, but they carried a faint whiff of poverty. The rich ate meat because they could. It was edible status. And then there were the fish days. Fridays, Saturdays, often Wednesdays, the whole of Lent 40 days without meat, without eggs, without cheese. Advent as well. Add it up across a year and something like a third of her childhood meals came out of a river or the sea. Salted herring, dried cod soaked overnight, eels, carp from the moat itself, which I find quietly delightful. The defensive ditch was also the pantry. In her childhood that rule came from the church and from nowhere else. What happened later is one of my favourite small ironies in English history. Once the break with Rome had happened, and the religious reasoning had been swept aside, the state kept the fish days anyway. Why, because the fishing fleet trained sailors, and sailors crewed the navy. The church had put fish on the table for the sake of the soul. The government kept it there for the sake of the ships. The afternoon was the part I would have wanted. The garden and the orchard. The dogs who were everywhere and had opinions, hawks on the glove. Horses which she learned to handle young because a woman of her class would spend a large part of her adult life on horseback whether she enjoyed it or not. Children's games that have barely changed at all, spinning tops, balls, cherry pits flicked across the flagstones, dolls of carved wood and scrap cloth, cards and dice played by everybody, adults included, with real money on the table, and no sense at all that this was inappropriate for the young, and the seasons ran through the whole of it like a pulse, Lent arriving with its long grey hunger, Easter breaking it open, the hay in June, the harvest in August, the smell of the orchards in September, and then the 12 days of Christmas when a house like this one turned itself upside down, greenery nailed over the doorways, music, a lord of misrule appointed to give absurd orders that everyone obeyed, gifts exchanged on the first day of January. For a child that fortnight must have been the brightest thing in the calendar. 12 days a year when the rules bent, and then the dark came back. I want to spend a moment on the dark because we have lost the ability to imagine it. In December in Kent you get around 8 hours of daylight and 16 hours of everything else. Beeswax candles were costly and reserved for the chapel and for guests. Tallow candles made of animal fat were the everyday option, and they smoked and dripped and smelled of the kitchen. Rushlights made from reeds dipped in fat gave a small flame for something like half an hour, so the evening was not brightly lit, it was firelit. Faces half in shadow, voices doing the work that screens do for us now. Supper somewhere around 5 or 6, more prayers, and then bed early because there was very little else you could do. Can I ask you something? When was the last time you were somewhere with no artificial light at all? Truly none. I can count my own on one hand, and every single time the thing that struck me was how loud my own thoughts became. She had that every night of her life. And now I have to tell you the part that sits underneath all of this. The thing that was always in the house, in every house, standing a little way behind the furniture. Death was domestic. Not distant, not sanitized. Not something that happened in a building specially designed for it out of sight. People died in the room they had slept in, with the household coming in to say goodbye and children present, because where else would the children be? And in her particular childhood, one thing arrived without warning and terrified everybody from labourers to kings: the English sweating sickness. I need to describe this carefully, and I'm going to keep it gentle. It began with a sense of dread, then a fever sudden and drenching, and it moved with astonishing speed. Contemporaries said that a person could seem well at dinner and be gone by supper. It struck England in waves: 1485, 1508, 1517, 1528, and it had a cruel habit that made it unlike anything else in that century. It preferred the strong, young men in their prime, wealthy households, court circles. The illnesses of that age usually fell hardest on the poor and the frail. This one walked into the best houses in England and helped itself. Then, after one last appearance in 1551, it disappeared from the historical record completely and has never been identified with certainty. Scientists have proposed theories for centuries. Nobody has closed the case. An illness that arrived out of nowhere terrorized a country for 66 years and then simply stopped. And I will tell you now so you can carry it with you. Anne Boleyn would meet that sickness herself years later at the most dangerous possible moment of her life. But that is a story for further along the road. For a child at Hever, the practical result was this: you grew up understanding that people can be removed. Not gradually, not with warning, between one meal and the next. I think that does something to a person. Not necessarily something cruel. Sometimes it makes them urgent. It teaches them that waiting politely for your turn is a gamble, and that the safe, patient, obedient path is only safe if you're given the time to walk it. 3 children ran through those small rooms sharing that same understanding. Mary, the elder sister, who by every surviving account was warm, easy company, the sort of person a room relaxes around. George the boy, quick and clever and charming, and treated from birth as the one who mattered because he carried the name forward. And Anne, the middle one, the watchful one, the one with the dark eyes who noticed things. I have to be careful here because we have almost no direct evidence about their childhood together, and anyone who tells you otherwise is filling in the gaps with imagination and hoping you will not check. But we do know how those 3 turned out, and we know that every single one of them ended up in the most dangerous room in England at the same time on the same side. Whatever happened in those small damp chambers by the water, it bound them together for the rest of their days. She was not Anne Boleyn yet. She was a girl in wool and pinned linen who ate carp from her own moat, who slept beside her sister, and who had already learned that the world does not always give you notice. But their ordinary day had another chapter in it that I skipped past on purpose. The schoolroom. Because a boy of her rank in that same house would have been handed Latin and a horse, and a future with his name written on it. She was handed something else entirely, and what they chose to teach her, and what they deliberately refused to, would shape everything that came after. Come with me and I will show you exactly what was in that room. There is an old music book sitting in a library in London. It is not much to look at. A set of part books French in origin filled with motets and chansons in a careful 16th century hand. The kind of thing a musician would prop open on a stand and work through piece by piece on a slow afternoon. But at the bottom of one page somebody has written 4 words. Mistress Anne Boleyn. Now thus. That was the Boleyn family motto. 2 little words that mean something closer to this is how things stand, or this is the way of it, and which sound, if I am honest, faintly like a shrug. Scholars still argue about that inscription. Some think it was written by Anne. Some think it belonged to her circle rather than her hand. That argument is not settled, and I am not going to pretend it is. But the book itself is beyond argument. It contains music by the finest composers in Europe at that moment, including Josquin des Prés, whose work was to that generation roughly what a great symphony would be to ours. and it is exactly the sort of volume that a wealthy English family would buy for a daughter who was expected to become very, very good at music. So let us follow that thread, because the hours we are about to walk through are the hours nobody films. There is no drama in them. No king, no scandal, no scaffold. Only a girl at a table doing what girls were told to do. And I would argue that those quiet hours built more of Anne Boleyn than anything that happened to her afterwards. Right, the syllabus. If you had been born a daughter of a well-placed English family around the turn of the 16th century, here is what would have been poured into you. You would learn to write and to write clearly, because a woman who could not manage a pen could manage a household or a correspondence. You would learn French, which was the language of courtesy and of diplomacy, and of every fashionable book worth owning. You would learn music, not as a hobby, as an accomplishment in the technical sense of that word, the lute, the virginal singing, and the ability to sight-sing a part in a group without embarrassing yourself. You would learn to dance and dance well and dance for hours, because dancing was where the court did its business. You would learn the needle. You would learn to run a great house, which meant provisioning brewing, preserving the still and basic medicine, and keeping accounts that actually balanced. You would learn to ride, to hunt, to fly a hawk, to shoot at the archery butts, to play at cards and dice and bowling without losing your temper. And you would learn manners in a sense of that word so much larger than ours that we barely have a translation for it. How to enter a chamber, who goes through a doorway first, when to speak and how long and to whom. Now at first glance that list looks like a finishing school. Decorative. Slight. I want to take it apart because I think it is one of the most misunderstood curricula in history. Start with the needle, since that is the one everybody smiles at. We picture embroidery as something soft and empty, a way to keep idle hands busy. That is a modern misunderstanding, and it is a big one. In the 16th century, textiles were wealth. A single embroidered altar cloth or a set of bed hangings could be worth more than a horse, sometimes more than a small house. What a woman produced with a needle went on walls, on beds, on the backs of the family, into churches. It was the visible proof of a household standing, and it was made almost entirely by women. George Wyatt, whose grandfather knew Anne personally and who gathered testimony from women who had served her, wrote that her skill with the needle was exceptional. There were pieces of her work still being used in the royal household long after she was gone. But here is the part I find far more interesting. Think about what embroidery actually is as an activity. It is hours of sitting, together, in one chamber, with your hands busy and your eyes down and your mouth entirely free. This sewing chamber was where the women of a household talked. It was where news arrived, where marriages were discussed before they were arranged, where reputations were built and quietly taken apart. It was an information network disguised as decoration, and it ran parallel to the men's world of council chambers and hunting parties, and it was often better informed. A girl who spent 5 or 6 hours a day in that room learned 2 things at once. She learned patience and precision with her hands, and she learned how information moves through a group of people. I do not think it is a coincidence that the woman who came out of those rooms turned out to be extraordinarily good at knowing things before other people knew them. Now take the household management, which sounds even duller. A gentlewoman running an estate was running an enterprise. She was responsible for feeding, clothing, and disciplining a staff that might number 30 or 40 people. She oversaw the brewing of ale by the barrel because nobody was drinking plain water if they could avoid it. She kept the still room, which meant she was in effect the household pharmacist, distilling remedies and treating fevers and burns and the endless small injuries of a world full of open fires and sharp tools. And she kept the books. Anne Boleyn was taught arithmetic and accounting as a child, not because anybody thought girls should study mathematics, but because a woman who could not add up would be robbed blind by her own steward. Does that sound like an ornamental education to you? It sounds to me like an apprenticeship in logistics. There is one more piece of this I want to give you, and it is the piece that gets left out most often. Books. A girl of Anne's rank had access to a small, strange library. Devotional works, obviously, saints' lives, and romances, long-looping French tales of knights and gardens and impossible love which were the popular fiction of the age, and which grown men worried about in exactly the way grown men have worried about girls' entertainment in every century since. But the book that mattered most was the Book of Hours. A Book of Hours was a private prayer book, and for many girls it was the first possession in the world that was truly and only theirs, not the family's, not her father's, hers. She carried it. She turned its pages every single day for years. And here is what women did with them. They wrote in the margins. Go through the surviving books of Hours from that century and you find them crowded with private additions. Birth dates of children, the names of the dead, little prayers, messages left for whoever might turn that page next, lines of verse, sometimes just a name written again and again the way a bored student writes on a desk. Those margins are one of the very few places in the 16th century where you can hear a woman speaking without a man holding the pen for her, and I think that is worth a moment of silence in itself. A whole population of intelligent people given one narrow strip of blank paper down the edge of a prayer, and using it to say quietly, "I was here, this happened to me, remember me." So the girls were not taught nothing. That is the first correction I want to make, because there is a lazy version of this story where Tudor women simply sat about being oppressed and decorative, and it is not true, and it insults them. But now I have to make the second correction. And this one is sharper, because there was something specific, something deliberate that girls were not taught. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. Boys of Anne's class went to grammar school. And what happened at a grammar school was not simply Latin vocabulary. Boys were trained in rhetoric. They learned how to construct an argument, how to arrange it, how to deliver it aloud. They stood up in front of their schoolfellows and made cases and defended them. They were drilled in the art of persuasion over and over for years. In other words, boys were taught how to change other people's minds in public. Girls were taught the exact opposite. In 1523, a Spanish scholar named Juan Luis Vives wrote a book about the education of women commissioned for the daughter of Catherine of Aragon. It became one of the most influential works on the subject in Europe, and Vives was for his time a supporter of female learning. He wanted girls to have books. He wanted them literate and thoughtful, but he drew one hard line. A woman, he said, should not be taught rhetoric. She should not learn to speak in public. Silence in a woman was not a deficiency, it was an ornament. Sit with that for a moment. The single skill that turns knowledge into power, the ability to stand in a room full of people and argue and be listened to, was the one skill formerly withheld. You could have the books, you could have the languages, you could have the music and the mathematics and the medicine. You could not have the floor. And I want to ask you something directly because I think it lands differently for different people. Think about your own education, not the subjects you took, the things nobody ever taught you that you only noticed you were missing years later when you needed them. How long did it take you to work out what had been left out? Now let me put three girls side by side, all growing up in England in almost the same years, and let us see what their educations were really for. The first is Margaret More, daughter of Sir Thomas More. Her father did something almost unheard of. He educated his daughters exactly as he educated his son. Latin, Greek, philosophy, astronomy, logic. Visitors to his house at Chelsea came away startled. In 1524, Margaret published a translation from Latin, one of the first books published by an Englishwoman under her own work, and Erasmus himself praised her mind. Margaret More married a scholar. She stayed out of politics. She survived her father's execution and died in her bed, and her learning was the great private joy of a private life. The second is Catherine of Aragon, older than the others, raised in Spain under a tutor who gave her the classics and fluent Latin. That education had a purpose too. She was being built to be a queen consort of a foreign kingdom, which meant she needed to be able to speak to ambassadors, argue her own corner and hold her ground alone in a country that was not hers. And it worked. When the crisis of her life arrived, Catherine could out-argue bishops. And then there is Anne. No Greek, no serious Latin that we can prove, nothing that would have impressed Erasmus over dinner. Instead, French like a native, music of professional quality, dancing that people remembered decades later, conversation, timing, wit, the ability to hold a room without ever appearing to try. 3 girls, 3 curricula, and each one is a prophecy. Sir Thomas More educated a daughter to think, the Spanish court educated a daughter to reign, and Thomas Boleyn educated a daughter to be placed. That is the honest reading of it, and I do not think we should soften it. But here is the twist, and it is the reason I wanted to spend this time with the schoolroom at all. The education that looked the shallowest turned out to be the most dangerous. Margaret More's learning made her admired. Catherine's learning made her formidable in argument, but Anne's training gave her something neither of them had, and something that Viv's and every other well-meaning man never thought to guard against. It gave her the room. Everything she was taught was a technique for holding attention. Music holds attention. Dance holds attention. Wit holds attention. Perfect French in an English court holds attention. She was drilled year after year in the art of being the most interesting person in the room. They took away her right to make a public argument, and then they trained her exhaustively in the art of being listened to. And I have always thought there is something almost funny about that, in a very dark way. A whole civilization carefully bolting the front door and leaving a window wide open in the ground floor. Before we move on, let me clear away 2 myths that have grown over all of this. The first is the idea of Anne Boleyn as a great scholar. You will see her described that way, and I understand the impulse because we want our heroines clever in the ways we recognize. But there is no solid evidence that she was a Latinist or a philosopher. Her intelligence was of a different order. It was fast applied and social. She was not the cleverest woman in England on paper. She was, I suspect, the quickest woman in any room she entered, and those are not the same thing at all. The second myth is a song. There is a mournful old piece called "O Death Rock Me Asleep," which has been attributed to Anne, supposedly written in her final days. It appears in countless retellings. It is beautiful, and it is haunting, and there is no reliable evidence whatsoever that she wrote it. The attribution came later from people who found the idea irresistible. And I mention that not to spoil anything, but because it is a small example of a very large problem in her story. Almost everything attributed to Anne Boleyn after her death was attributed by someone with a reason. So, where does that leave the girl? By the time she was, let us say, 11 or 12 years old, she could write a letter, keep a tune run, a room count, money sit still for 6 hours, and make herself pleasant to people who outranked her. In a country where the great majority of women could not sign their own name, she was already among a tiny handful. She was in the language of her father's world ready, which is the most chilling word in this entire story, because ready always means ready for something, and ready for something always means ready to be sent. And somewhere in the summer of 1513, on a road in Kent, a rider was making his way toward a moated house with a letter in his bag, carrying an offer that would take that child out of England altogether. Nobody asked her. Nobody was going to. Let me take you out of the house for a while. Because the decision that ended her childhood was not made at Havre. It was not made by her mother or her nurse or anybody who had ever heard her laugh. It was made in a panelled room in a city she had never seen, roughly 200 miles away, by a group of men arguing about war. The year is 1512. The room is in Mechlin, in what we would now call Belgium, and one of the men in it is her father. He is not the most important person there. He is not a duke or a bishop. He is a knight from Kent with a very particular skill, and he has been sent because of it. Thomas Boleyn could speak French. I know how small that sounds. Let me tell you why it was not small at all. In the England of 1512, French was the language of diplomacy, of treaties, of the whole conversation of European power, and the number of Englishmen who could sit in a room and negotiate in it without an interpreter, leaning over their shoulder, translating, softening, guessing, and occasionally getting it catastrophically wrong, that number was tiny. Thomas Boleyn was on that very short list. He was fluent in French and comfortable in Latin, and the great humanist scholar Erasmus, who was not in the habit of flattering minor English knights, thought him worth dedicating work to. So when a young king wanted something delicate handled abroad, Boleyn's name came up. And the young king wanted a great deal. Henry VIII was 21 years old and had been on the throne for 3 years. He had inherited a full treasury, a peaceful country, and a father's reputation for careful, unglamorous accounting. He found all of this unbearable. What he wanted was France. What he wanted was to be the second coming of Henry V, riding through mud towards a battle that poets would still be writing about a century later. What he wanted, and I say this with a certain affection, was to be spectacular. To invade France, he needed allies. And so English envoys went out across Europe, assembling one of those alliances that look magnificent on parchment and tend to fall apart the moment somebody's asked to actually turn up. Which brings us to the woman Thomas Boleyn had been sent to charm, Margaret of Austria, regent of the Netherlands, daughter of the Holy Roman Emperor, aunt of the boy who would grow up to rule half the known world. She had been married 3 times and widowed 3 times before she was 25, and after the 3rd she declined to try again. She ruled instead, in her own name, with her own council from her own palace. I will show you that palace properly in a moment, because it deserves its own chapter. For now I want you to see her across a negotiating table, because that is where Thomas Boleyn met her, and that is where this whole story turns. They liked each other. That is not sentiment. That is documented. The two of them fell into the kind of easy professional warmth that any of you who have ever had a truly good working relationship will recognize instantly. They talked. They joked. At one point they made a wager with one another the way colleagues do over a matter of political prediction. Boleyn won it. I would give a great deal for a transcript of that conversation. A Kentish knight and a Habsburg princess betting on the outcome of a European war in French in the spring of 1513. The negotiation succeeded. In April of that year the agreement was sealed. England, the Emperor Spain, and the Pope were bound together against France. And then everything happened at once. That summer Henry crossed the Channel with an enormous army, and had the small, absurd, deeply satisfying victory he'd been dreaming of. The French cavalry broke and ran so quickly that the English named the encounter after the spurs the French were using to get away. The city of Tournai fell. Meanwhile, back home something far more serious was unfolding. The Scots invaded the north of England, and on a wet field in Northumberland in September, an English army destroyed them and killed their king, and left the Scottish nobility gutted in a single afternoon. The man commanding that English army was Thomas Howard, Earl of Surrey, Anne Boleyn's grandfather. Think about what that autumn looked like from inside her family. On one side of the sea her father is standing beside a triumphant king in captured French territory. On the other, her grandfather has just won the most significant land battle England would fight for generations, and is about to be handed back the dukedom his family had lost. The Boleyns were not simply rising. They were being carried upwards on a tide, and it was precisely at this moment, with everybody's stock at its highest, that Thomas Boleyn asked Margaret of Austria for a favour. Not money, not land, not an office. A place for his daughter. Now I want to be sure you understand what he was asking for, because if I just say he sent her abroad to be educated, you will nod politely and miss the size of it. Margaret's household was the most desirable finishing school in Europe. There were a limited number of positions for young gentlewomen. Every noble family from Spain to Savoy wanted one. These places were not bought with cash. There was no fee, no application, no waiting list you could join by being wealthy. They were given as personal favours by a princess to people she liked, which is why the wager matters, which is why the fluent French matters. Thomas Boleyn spent 2 years building a relationship with one of the most powerful women in Europe, and then he cashed it in, and what he bought with it was his middle daughter's future. You can call that cold. I have heard people call it cold. I think it is the single most useful thing he ever did for her, and I think he knew it. Now here is the wrinkle, and it is a real one. The girls who served in Margaret's household were normally taken at around 12 to 14 years old. That was the working age for the role. Younger than that, and you were not a lady-in-waiting. You were a child who needed minding. Some historians have suggested that this is exactly what happened. That Anne did not go to Mechlin as one of the maids of honour at all, but was placed instead in the schoolroom alongside the royal children Margaret was raising. And those children were not ordinary children. Margaret was bringing up her late brother's 4 orphans. The eldest boy was 13 in the summer of 1513. Quiet, awkward, with a jaw that would become one of the most caricatured features in European history. He would grow up to be Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, ruler of Spain, the Netherlands, Naples, and an empire in the Americas so vast that people started saying the sun never set on it. He was also the nephew of Catherine of Aragon. Which means that somewhere in that building in that same year, a small English girl and a shy Habsburg boy were being taught in the same rooms. And 20 years later he would be the single most powerful obstacle standing between her and the throne of England. He would lean on popes, he would apply pressure that shook Christendom, all to protect his aunt's marriage from a woman he may once have shared a schoolroom with. I have no proof they ever spoke. Nobody does. But the thought of it keeps me awake sometimes. Before we put her on the road, I want to ask you something, and I would love an answer in the comments. Why, Anne? Because there was another daughter. Mary was older. Mary was, by every account, we have the prettier one, the warmer one, the easier one. If you were choosing a child to send into the most sophisticated court in Europe, the obvious pick would have been the elder girl with the lovely manners. He chose the middle one. We do not know why. Nobody wrote it down. But I have a theory, and it is only a theory, so hold it loosely. I think he chose the one who was watching him. I think in a house full of children he had noticed which one asked questions at the table, and which one picked up a French phrase from his mouth and turned it over, and which one was already a little too clever for a country manor in Kent. Fathers notice things. Ambitious fathers notice them faster. There is a colder explanation too, and it is probably sitting alongside mine rather than replacing it. Mary was the elder. Mary was approaching the age at which a girl of her rank became useful on the English marriage market, and a daughter you intend to trade at home is a daughter you keep where buyers can see her. Send her abroad for 8 years, and she comes back 22 years old, foreign in her manners and harder to place. So perhaps it was not a compliment at all. Perhaps Anne was simply the one who could be spared. Both things can be true at once. That is what I have learned about this family. Their affection and their arithmetic were never in separate rooms. So the preparations. A chest was packed, and it was expensive. You could not arrive at a Burgundian court dressed like a girl from a moated house in Kent. Fabric was bought. Linen counted. Money was set aside for a tutor for lodging for the 100 small costs of keeping a child in another country. An escort was arranged from her father's own men because a young gentlewoman did not travel alone and the roads had opinions about strangers. And then on a morning in the summer of 1513 she came out through the gatehouse and did not go back. Picture the road south. Kent in July, which is one of the loveliest things England does. Hedges shoulder high, hops climbing their poles, dust rising behind the horses in the warm air. Then the ground begins to rise and the smell changes, and at the top of the last hill there it is. The sea. I wonder if she'd ever seen it. There is no way to know, but there is a fair chance that the first time Anne Boleyn looked at open water, she was on her way to being handed to a stranger. The crossing to Calais was short in theory. In practice, it depended entirely on the mood of the channel, and small ships in the 1500s did not negotiate with weather. Some crossings took 6 hours, some took 4 days of sitting in harbour waiting for the cold air to change direction. And then the Low Countries, flat-wide crisscrossed with canals and windmills and church towers you can see for an hour before you reach them. Bruges, Ghent, Antwerp, the richest, busiest, most commercial landscape in northern Europe, thick with painters and bankers and cloth, every mile of it further from her mother. And that is the part I keep circling back to. Elizabeth Boleyn watched her daughter go through that gate in the summer of 1513. Anne would not come back to England to stay until the very end of 1521. 8 years. 8 years of a childhood given away in a room where the child was not present in exchange for something the child had not asked for. There is no letter from her mother, no record of what was said at the door or whether anything was said at all, or whether Elizabeth Howard, who had buried children of her own, simply stood there and behaved impeccably as women of her rank were trained to do. If you've ever put a child on a plane or watched one drive away with everything they own in the back of the car, you know the exact shape of that silence, and you had telephones. She had nothing but the post, and the post took weeks and half of it never arrived. But we do have something. Somewhere in the late summer of that year, a letter arrived back in England, written in Margaret of Austria's own household, addressed to Thomas Boleyn. She acknowledges the letter he sent. She notes that his squire has delivered his daughter to her, and then she says something that I find quietly extraordinary. She says she finds the girl so bright and so pleasant for her tender age that she's more in debt to him for sending her than he is to her for taking her. That is a princess telling a knight that he has given her the better end of the bargain. And here is the detail that stops me every time I go over that document. As far as anybody can tell, this is the earliest surviving piece of paper in the world that mentions Anne Boleyn. Not her baptism, not a family record, not a proud note from a parent. The first time she appears in the written history of the human race she's being received. Delivered by one man, accepted by a woman and remarked upon like a promising acquisition. She's a child in a strange building in a country whose language she does not speak, and the earliest trace of her existence is a receipt. I have thought about that a lot, and I want to be careful not to turn Thomas Boleyn into a villain because I do not think he was one. By the standards of his own century, he had just done something magnificent for his daughter. He had taken a girl who might have spent her whole life managing a household in Kent and put her inside the machinery of European power. He gave her the best gift he had. He simply never considered that she might have wanted a different one, and she was still not Anne Boleyn, not yet. She was a small, tired, dust-covered traveller being helped down from a horse, in a courtyard in Mechlin, holding on to whatever she had brought from home, about to be looked at by a great many strangers. The doors ahead of her were about to open, and behind them was a world she could not possibly have imagined from a moated house in Kent. Tapestries the size of walls, a library that would have been the envy of half of Europe, musicians, painters, books nobody in England had heard of. And at the centre of all of it, a woman ruling alone and doing it superbly. Come inside with me. This is where she starts becoming somebody. Picture a small girl tired from the road being taken through a doorway in a town in the Low Countries. She has been travelling for days. Her French is poor. She's about to be presented to one of the most powerful people on the continent of Europe, and she has been told more than once not to embarrass anybody. And as she walks through those rooms toward the presentation chamber, she passes the paintings on the walls. One of them shows a man and a woman standing together in a bedchamber. There's a little dog at their feet, a convex mirror on the back wall, a chandelier with one candle burning. If that description sounds familiar, it should. That painting hangs in the National Gallery in London today, and people queue around a corner to stand in front of it. It is the double portrait by Jan van Eyck that we usually call the Arnolfini portrait, and in the year 1516 it was listed in writing in an inventory of the collection belonging to the woman Anne Boleyn had come to serve. So here is the first thing I want you to hold in your mind about this chapter of her life. She was a girl from a moated house in Kent, and she was now walking past one of the greatest paintings in the history of Western art on her way to lunch. Nothing in her life would ever be small again. The town was Mechlin, which the French called Malines, and in 1513 it was for practical purposes the capital of the Burgundian Netherlands. Not the largest city, not the richest, but the place where the paperwork of an empire was signed, and the person who signed it was Margaret of Austria. Now, if you take one new name away from this whole story, I would like it to be hers, because she is one of those historical figures who ought to be famous and somehow is not, and once you know what happened to her, everything Anne Boleyn later became starts to make a different kind of sense. Margaret was born in 1480 into the ruling house of the Habsburgs, which meant she was from the hour of her birth a piece on a board. At the age of 3, she was betrothed to the heir to the throne of France and sent to be raised there so that she would grow up French for the country she was meant to rule. 3 years old, handed across a border, she spent 8 years being trained as the future Queen of France, and then the King of France changed his mind. He wanted a different bride, one who came with the Duchy of Brittany attached. So Margaret was set aside, and because international politics has never been sentimental, she was not immediately sent home. She was kept in France for another 2 years as leverage while her father and her former fiancé argued. She was 13 when she finally came back, publicly humiliated, educated for a crown that no longer existed. Try that on for a childhood and then ask yourself what kind of adult it produces. 4 years later, she was married again to the heir to the throne of Spain. He died within 6 months. She was pregnant when he died, and the baby did not survive either. And on the voyage out to that marriage, her ship had run into a terrible storm in the Bay of Biscay. Everyone on board expected to drown, and the young Margaret, waiting in the dark for the sea to decide, wrote her own epitaph in verse and tied it to her wrist so that whoever found her body would know who she was. It said more or less that here lies Margaret, the gentle damsel who had 2 husbands and still died a maid. She was 17 years old, and she was making a joke about her own funeral in rhyme in a sinking ship. I have adored her since the moment I first came across that story. She married once more to the Duke of Savoy, and by all accounts she was happy, and after 3 years he died as well. She was 24, 3 marriages, nothing to show for any of them, and at that point Margaret of Austria did something remarkable. She stopped. She refused every offer that came afterwards, and there were many, and some of them were extremely advantageous. She built a great church to hold her husband's tomb, and she took the government of the Netherlands into her own hands as regent for her father, and later as guardian of her young nephew. And she governed, for the better part of 23 years. Treaties, revenue, war trade, disputes, the endless management of 17 quarrelsome provinces. Years after Anne had gone, Margaret would sit down at Cambrai with the mother of the King of France, and the 2 of them would negotiate an end to a war that their menfolk had failed to finish. People at the time called it the Ladies' Peace, 2 women across a table ending a conflict between 2 kings. That is the household Anne Boleyn was placed into. Let me take you inside it because the physical setting matters. Margaret's court was not a party. It was an administration with excellent taste. Her library was among the finest in Europe, several hundred volumes and manuscripts catalogued and maintained. She collected paintings seriously, and at scale at a time when almost nobody thought of art as something a person deliberately assembled. Her chapel employed some of the great composers of the age, and she had songbooks compiled for her own use. She wrote poetry herself, and through all of it moved ambassadors, secretaries, clerks and petitioners, because this was the working seat of a government. She also had children in the house, and this is the detail that still gives me a slight chill. Being raised under Margaret's supervision at that time were her nephew and nieces, a boy of about 13 and 3 girls. The boy would become Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, ruler of Spain, and the Netherlands and half of the New World, and the most powerful man in Christendom. 2 of the girls would become queens of France and of Denmark. The third would grow up to govern the Netherlands herself. So somewhere in those corridors in the year 1513, a little English girl was learning her French in the same building as a boy who would one day be the single greatest obstacle to her becoming Queen of England. Because Charles V was the nephew of Catherine of Aragon, and when the moment came 20 years later when Anne needed the Pope to set Catherine aside, it was Charles who made certain that it never happened. Did they ever speak? We have no idea. Probably not much. He was a prince and she was a junior member of a large household. But I would give a great deal to know whether either of them ever remembered. Now what did a girl actually do in that house? The demoiselles of honour were not guests. They were staff, and the work was real. You attended the regent. You carried things. You waited sometimes for hours in an antechamber. You learned the order of precedence so thoroughly that you could have arranged a dinner in your sleep. You sang when asked. You danced when required. You said very little, and you were watched constantly by a governess whose entire job was your conduct. Now let me put you in her shoes for a moment, because we skate over this part far too quickly. Imagine those first weeks. Everybody around you is speaking rapidly in a language you have perhaps 40 words of. You do not know when meals happen. You do not know which door you are allowed through. Every time somebody laughs, you have to guess whether it was at you. The food is unfamiliar. The bells ring at different hours. Nobody in the building shares a single memory with you, and you're at the outside 12 years old. Have you ever been the one foreigner in a room? The one person who is half a beat behind every joke? Most of us have had an afternoon of that or a week of it on a bad holiday. And we remember it because it is so uncomfortable. She had it for a year with no way home and with a father waiting for reports. There is a particular kind of alertness that grows in a child in that situation. You stop relying on words and start relying on faces. You watch shoulders and eyebrows and the direction people turn when somebody important comes in. You become out of pure necessity a very good reader of rooms. Hold that thought. It is going to matter enormously later. Which brings me to the single most precious surviving thing from Anne Boleyn's childhood. A letter. She wrote it to her father from a place she spells as Veur, which was almost certainly one of Margaret's residences in the countryside near Brussels. It is in French. It is in her own handwriting. It has survived. And it is as far as anybody can establish the earliest sound of Anne Boleyn's own voice that exists in the world. Here is roughly what she says. She understands from his letter that he wishes her to be a woman of good reputation when she comes to court. She's delighted to hear that the Queen will take the trouble to speak with her, because talking with such a wise and worthy person is a pleasure to think about. This makes her want to work harder at speaking French properly, and at her spelling especially since he has asked her to. Then she apologizes for the letter itself. She says the spelling comes out of her own head, whereas the earlier letters were only written by her hand. Sit with that sentence, because it is doing an enormous amount of quiet work. Only written by her hand, meaning the earlier letters home were dictated to her or copied. Somebody composed them, and she wrote them out neatly the way a child copies a card at Christmas. This one is hers, the words are hers, the mistakes are hers, and then she explains why. Her tutor, a man named Semonet, told her the letter would simply have to wait until she wrote it herself, so that nobody else would know what she was writing to her father. I find that unbearably touching. Somebody in that palace, a working tutor whose name we barely know, looked at this foreign child and decided that she deserved a private line to her own family, that she should be allowed to say something that had not been checked first. So what does she use it for? She uses it to promise to work harder. She's a small girl hundreds of miles from her mother in a country where she can barely make herself understood given one page of genuine privacy. and she spends it reassuring her father that she is improving. Nobody had to teach that child anxiety. It was already installed. And the French is bad. Historians agree on that. The spelling is phonetic, the grammar wobbles, one or two phrases are hard to make out at all. It is the writing of somebody at the very beginning of a language, which makes what happened next rather astonishing. Within a few years she was taken for a native speaker. Margaret, for her part, wrote to Thomas Boleyn about his daughter, and her verdict has come down to us. She found the girl so bright and so pleasant for such a young age that she considered herself more in his debt for sending the child than he was in hers for taking her. Look at that again as a parent rather than as a historian. The most powerful woman in Northern Europe running a government taking the time to write to a mid-ranking English diplomat and tell him that his daughter is a delight, and then think about how a letter like that would have been used. Because it went straight into the family archive and it went straight into the family strategy. Here, though, is what I actually think the Netherlands gave her, and it is not the French. It is a category. Anne Boleyn spent her earliest years in a country that had never in its history been governed by a woman. England had no queen who ruled in her own right, none not once. The English model of female power was the model of influence. A wife who whispers, a mother who suggests, a woman who gets things done by asking the right man on the right evening. And then a 12-year-old was set down inside a palace where a woman signed the treaties, not a consort, not an influence, the principal, the person whose seal made a document real, who received ambassadors in her own name, who was addressed as the government because she was the government. There is a line associated with Margaret, a piece of advice she's supposed to have offered, warning that if you trust the people who come offering you their service, you will very soon find yourself among the deceived. I would suggest that Anne learned both halves of that education, the possibility and the price. Let me knock over one myth before we go on because it is a persistent one. You will often see it said that Anne Boleyn was sent abroad to acquire French sophistication, and that word usually arrives with a slight wink, as though she was enrolled in some finishing school for charm and flirtation. The reality is almost the opposite. Margaret's household was disciplined, devout, and heavily supervised. It was closer to a civil service with a chapel attached. The lessons on offer were protocol languages, music, and the daily observation of how power is actually operated. And the other thing people constantly get wrong is the geography. Retellings collapse all of these years into her time in France. They skip the Netherlands entirely or give it a sentence. Yet this was the first door. The first time she was somewhere that expected something of her. The least discussed year of her childhood and possibly the one that rearranged her most. It lasted barely a year, because in the summer of 1514 the alliances shifted as alliances do, and a letter went from Greenwich to Mechelen asking for the little Boleyn to be released and sent home. She was being moved again. She had no more say in it than she had the first time. But before we follow her onto that road, I want to go back to one phrase in that letter of hers. 6 words she wrote down in wobbly French at the age of about 12. A woman of good reputation, she wrote it the way a child writes a school motto without knowing what is inside it. So let us find out what was inside it. Let us look at what reputation actually meant for a woman in that century, what it cost to build, how quickly it could be taken away, and why in the end it was the only property most women were ever permitted to own. 2 women arrive at the same doorway at the same moment. Nothing is said, nobody consults a rule book. But in the space of about half a second, both of them have worked out which one goes first, and both of them are correct. That is the world she has just walked into, and I want to spend some time in it with you because underneath all the tapestries and the music a court was a machine. It had moving parts, it had rules, and almost none of those rules were written down anywhere a modern person could look them up. She was expected to learn them by watching, quickly, silently, without ever asking. Let us begin with the doorway since we are standing in it. Precedence, that is the word for it, and it governed everything. Who walked first, who sat above the salt and who sat below it, whose chair had arms and whose did not, whose cushion was velvet, who was served first and second and 11th, whether you sat or stood or knelt in the room where somebody of higher rank was eating. Every one of those things was fixed by birth and office, and every one of them was visible to everybody in the room. I find something almost funny about it now from a safe distance. Imagine an entire society running on a seating chart that nobody was allowed to complain about. But at the time it was not funny at all. It was the operating system. Get it wrong and you had not made a social mistake. You had made a claim. You had announced in public that you believed yourself to be something you were not. And people went to law over this. Families feuded for generations about who stood where at a funeral. Now stay with me because it goes further than furniture. In the England she came from and across most of Europe there were laws telling you what you were allowed to wear. They were called Acts of Apparel, and one of the more detailed English versions had been passed in the year 1510 when she was very small. Cloth of gold and purple silk were kept for the royal family. Sable fur belonged to the highest ranks of the nobility and nobody else. Velvet of certain colours, satin, damask, the amount of gold thread permitted on a sleeve, the length of a train, the type of fur on a collar. All of it was regulated by rank and by income, and breaking those rules carried a penalty. Think about what that means for a moment. You could look across a hall at a total stranger and before either of you had spoken a word you would know their approximate position in the world, their family's standing and roughly what they were worth. Their clothing was a public statement of legal status. We think we invented signalling with what we wear. We did not. We simply removed the law and kept the judgment. So she is learning precedence, she is learning what she may and may not put on her back. And now comes the harder curriculum, and this is the part I think about most. She is learning how to be looked at. A young gentlewoman in a princely household was almost never out of sight. She slept in a shared chamber with other girls under the eye of an older woman whose entire job was supervision. She ate in company. She walked in company. She was accompanied to chapel, accompanied in the garden, accompanied to another room 3 doors along. That older woman was not there for comfort. She was there as a witness. She existed so that if anybody ever asked a question about the girls in her care, there would be somebody who could answer it. And people did ask. There was a physical training to all of this as well, and it is the part that never survives into film because film needs people to move naturally. And this was the opposite of natural. She had to learn how to stand still for a long time. Properly still with her hands in a fixed position while other people ate a meal that took 2 hours. She had to learn to kneel to offer a cup and rise again without using her hands in stiff clothing weighed down by wool and fur. She had to learn to leave a room in front of somebody royal without ever turning her back to them, which means walking backwards at speed through doorways without looking. Try that in your kitchen sometime and report back to me. She had to learn the depth of a curtsy, and there was a depth for everybody. Deeper for a princess, deeper still for an emperor. Too shallow was an insult. Too deep was mockery, or worse, it looked like you were trying to flatter somebody into something. And she had to learn all of it in a body that was still growing while she was tired in a language she did not speak. I think we underestimate how physically demanding a girlhood like this was. We picture leisure. It was closer to an apprenticeship, and the tool she was learning to use was herself. Because here is the mechanism at the heart of everything, and once you see it, the rest of Anne Boleyn's story looks different forever. Her reputation was not a feeling, it was an asset. For a man of that century honour meant several things: his courage, his word, his loyalty to his lord, his willingness to defend all of the above. For a woman, honour narrowed down to almost one thing, and that one thing was her sexual reputation. Not her behaviour, her reputation. The two are not the same, and that gap is where the cruelty sits. because a marriage in her class was a financial arrangement between two families. Land moved, money moved, titles were secured and inheritances were protected, and every part of it rested on a single assumption that the children this woman produced would be without question her husband's. A doubt about her name was a doubt about the entire agreement. So a rumour was not gossip, a rumour was damage to property. And I want to give you a number here because this is where the social history becomes very hard to look away from. When historians go through the surviving papers of the church courts of that era, where ordinary people took their disputes about morality and marriage, they find that defamation suits make up an enormous share of the business. And when they sort those suits by who was suing, and about what an overwhelming majority turn out to be women going to law to defend their sexual reputation against words spoken by somebody in their street, women were not passive about this. They fought constantly, in public in front of neighbours at real cost. They fought because they had to. A woman's name was in a very literal sense the largest thing she owned. It determined whether she married and whom, and whether she could hold a position in a household, and whether her children were secure. She could not vote. She could not in most circumstances hold land in her own right once she married. She could not go to a university. She could not practice law or medicine. But she had her name, and she could lose it in an afternoon to a sentence spoken by somebody who did not like her. Can I ask you something? If your standing in the world could be dismantled by a rumour you could not disprove, how would that change the way you behaved in a room? Would you speak less, or would you learn to speak so well that nobody could catch you? Now, here is the trap, and it is a beautiful, vicious, perfectly constructed trap, and every young woman at every European court had to walk through it. Because that same court which watched her constantly and would destroy her for a whisper also ran on flirtation. This was the age of courtly love. It was a formal game with formal moves, and it was played in public at every court in Europe all the time. A gentleman selected a lady. He wrote verses about her. He wore her colours. He sighed dramatically in her direction, and told anyone who would listen that he was dying of love and she was cruel beyond measure. She in turn was expected to be gracious, witty, entirely charming and completely unattainable. It was theatre. Everybody knew it was theatre. Husbands watched their wives being courted by other men and thought nothing of it, because the entire point was that nothing was supposed to happen. So consider the position of a 14-year-old girl learning her way through this. Be dull and you have failed. You have not learned grace, you attract no attention. No family notices you, and your value on the marriage market quietly drops. Be too warm, be too available. Misjudge the temperature of a single conversation by 1 degree, and the machinery of reputation turns on you, and there is no appeal because you cannot prove a thing that did not happen. She had to be dazzling and untouchable at once, every day, in front of an audience. And I have come to believe that this is the actual education of Anne Boleyn. Not the languages, not the music, not the dancing, lovely as it all was. This, the years of standing in a room reading the temperature of it, working out who was in favour and who had slipped, noticing which laugh was real, and which was performance, learning exactly how much wit was charming and where the line sat. Learning to hold her face still. That is a skill. It is a rare and difficult one, and she became one of the greatest practitioners of it in the 16th century. There is another layer to this that I do not think gets enough attention. She was surrounded by professional observers. Every significant court in Europe hosted ambassadors, and an ambassador's job was to write home, weekly, sometimes daily. Long, detailed letters describing who had spoken to whom, who looked unwell, who'd been seen walking in the garden with whom, what the mood was, what the gossip was, what it might mean. Those dispatches are why we know anything at all about this period. They are also, when you sit with the thought, deeply unsettling. There were men in that building being paid to notice things about the people in it, and send those observations to foreign governments. She grew up inside a surveillance system, a slow paper-based quill and sealing wax surveillance system, and one of the most effective the pre-modern world ever built. And here is the thing I keep coming back to. Decades later, when everything fell apart for her, the case against her was not built out of evidence in the way we would understand evidence. It was built out of conversations, out of things said in rooms, out of the recollections of people who had been standing nearby, remembering or claiming to remember a look, a phrase, a moment at a doorway. The machine that raised her was the same machine that ended her. She learned to operate it better than almost anybody alive, and it was still in the end pointed at her, and she could no more argue with it than you can argue with weather. I said I would keep this gentle, and I will. We are not going anywhere near that scaffold in this stretch of road. I only want you to see the shape of the thing early, because it was already fully assembled around a girl of 14 who was still working out where to stand at dinner. The woman running that household understood all of this perfectly. Margaret of Austria had a personal motto, and it is one of the strangest and most haunting things I know from that century. It goes, "Fortune, misfortune makes one strong." That is one translation. It is a deliberate word puzzle in Old French, and it can be turned several ways. Some argue it means fortune greatly troubles one woman, 3 husbands, 3 losses, a regency held in her own hands in a world that did not want women holding anything. She had that phrase carved and painted where people could look at it. I like to imagine a small English girl standing underneath it, sounding out the words she did not yet understand in a language she was still learning. Let me leave you with one more thought before we move. We look at all of this and we feel a comfortable distance. No sumptuary laws now, no seating charts, no chaperone. And then I remember that we built something that watches more closely than any ambassador ever could. We built a place where a sentence can outlive the person who said it, where reputation is a currency, again where the crowd arrives faster than any court gossip and stays longer. We took away the rules and kept the judging. So when you hear people say she was arrogant or that she was too clever for her own good or too visible or too much, I would like you to hold that up against the training she was given. She was raised to be watched. She simply grew up to be extremely good at it. Tell me what you think in the comments. Do we understand her better now than her own century did, or are we just wearing different clothes and making the same noise? Now hold on to that image of her standing in a doorway doing the arithmetic of rank in half a second, because a letter was about to arrive that would pull the ground out from under her a second time. The alliances she had crossed the sea to serve were about to be thrown away. Her father was going to ask for her back. And within a matter of weeks, this girl who had finally learned how to survive in one royal household was going to be packed into a ship in the middle of a storm and delivered to another country entirely. The sea is waiting for her again. Stay with me. The harbour at Dover, early October in the year 1514. 14 ships, cannon on the walls, trumpets, chests of plate and cloth of gold being carried up gangplanks by men who've been working since before dawn. And on the quayside, a king saying goodbye to his favourite sister. He had spent a fortune on this. The gowns alone, the jewels, the horses, the hangings for her chambers in a country she'd never seen. Henry VIII did nothing quietly, and he adored this girl. He was also at that exact moment selling her, and standing somewhere in that crowd of attendants in the second or third rank, where the children of ambitious families stand, was a girl who'd been back in England for a matter of weeks after a year in the Low Countries, and who was now being put onto a ship again. She had barely unpacked. Let me explain how this happened, because the speed of it is the point. For 6 years, English policy had rested on a Habsburg alliance. Princess Mary, the king's sister, had been betrothed since childhood to Charles of Castile, that same boy growing up in the household we have just left. It was settled. Everybody knew it. And then over the course of a single summer, the whole arrangement collapsed. The Allies were unreliable. The war had gone nowhere. and in August of 1514 England made peace with France instead. Peace treaties in that century were not signed, they were married, so the 18-year-old princess who'd been raised to be Queen of Spain was informed that she would instead be Queen of France, to a man she had never met. His name was Louis XII. He was 52 years old, which in that century was properly old. He suffered badly from gout. His health had been poor for years. He had buried 2 wives, and the second, Anne of Brittany, had died only that January. And he had a problem that no amount of medicine could fix. He had no son. His heir was his young cousin Francis of Angoulême, 20 years old, athletic, clever, magnetic, and utterly certain that the throne was coming to him. Francis was already married to Louis's daughter Claude, which tied everything up neatly, unless the old king produced a boy. So when England offered a fresh, healthy 18-year-old princess, Louis did not hesitate. This was not romance. This was a last attempt at a dynasty. And I want you to understand what that means for Mary Tudor standing on that quay in her new gowns. Every single person in France was about to watch her body for news. Now, here is the part of this story that I find quietly magnificent, and it is not often told properly. Mary Tudor did not go quietly. She was young, she was very beautiful by every account we have, and she was in love with somebody else entirely. Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, the king's closest friend, a man with a complicated marital history and enormous charm and absolutely no royal blood whatsoever. And before she agreed to go, Mary made a bargain with her brother. She would marry the King of France, as she was told. She would do her duty, but if she survived him, the next husband would be her own choice. We know about this because she reminded Henry of it afterwards in writing, and because she never once let him forget it. Think about that for a second. An 18-year-old girl sitting across from one of the most volatile men in Europe negotiating terms. And I want to ask you honestly, because I think this is one of those questions that separates people. If you had been in her position with no power to refuse and no way out, would you have thought to ask for that? Would you have had the presence of mind at 18 to bargain for the second half of your life while somebody was auctioning off the first? Because I am not at all sure I would have. The proxy wedding took place at Greenwich in August, with a French nobleman standing in for the groom, and then the fleet sailed. And the sea, as it so often does in this story, had opinions. The crossing was brutal. A gale scattered the ships across the channel. Some vessels were driven miles off course. At least one was lost. Mary's own ship could not make its intended harbour, and ended up grounding in the shallows near Boulogne, where a knight named Sir Christopher Garnish waded into the surf and carried the future Queen of France ashore in his arms soaked to the skin. That is how she arrived, not on a golden barge, carried through cold water by a man in wet armour while half her wardrobe was somewhere out in the Channel. If Anne Boleyn was on one of those ships, and the evidence suggests she was then, her second departure from England ended with a shipwreck of sorts and a landing on a beach. I sometimes think the sea was trying to tell that family something. They were married at Abbeville on the 9th of October. Louis, to be fair to him, seems to have been delighted with her. He was ill and elderly, and he had just acquired the most admired young woman in Europe, and he behaved rather like a man who cannot quite believe his luck. He gave her jewels. He wrote to her brother in glowing terms. The morning after the wedding, he made a remark about the night just past that was, let us say, optimistic, and the French court enjoyed it enormously and repeated it for weeks. And then one day later he did something that turned the whole occasion sour. He dismissed her household. Not all of it, but most of it, and crucially the older English women who had come with her, including the formidable Lady Guildford, who had been with Mary since she was small and was the closest thing she had to a mother in that country. The official reasoning was that a French queen should be served by French women. The practical reasoning was that a queen surrounded by her own countrywomen is a queen with allies, and an old king marrying a foreign teenager did not want a faction growing in her bedchamber. Mary wrote home about it, and her letters are not the letters of a passive girl. She wrote to her brother. She wrote to Cardinal Wolsey. She said with some force that she'd been left alone among strangers, that she was not being treated as she'd been promised, and that she needed her people back. She did not get them back, but a small number of the young ones were allowed to remain. Girls too junior to be political. Girls who could be dismissed as ornaments. Anne Boleyn was one of them. And there it is again, the pattern that runs through this entire childhood. She survives by being underestimated. There is one more thing about that household list, and it is easy to miss. Anne was not the only Boleyn on those ships. Her elder sister Mary had come across as well. For a short stretch of that autumn, the two girls were in the same foreign court at the same time, which is a thing that almost never happened again. We cannot say for certain how long they overlapped. The records for junior attendance are thin, and historians have argued about it for decades. What we do know is that Mary was back in England within a few years, and married off to a gentleman of the King's Chamber early in 1520. Anne stayed abroad for another 7, and I think about that fork in the road more than almost anything else in this story. Two sisters on the same beach in the same wet gowns at the beginning of the same adventure. One goes home and becomes what a daughter was supposed to become. The other one keeps going. Now the machinery started. Mary was crowned at Saint-Denis in November, and made her formal entry into Paris the following day through streets full of pageants and fountains running with spiced drink. She was magnificent. Everyone said so. And behind the celebrations the arithmetic never stopped. Francis of Angoulême, the heir, was in an impossible position. Every day that passed without a pregnancy was a good day for him. He also, by several accounts, found the new queen extremely attractive, which was a problem because his own mother, Louise of Savoy, understood the danger perfectly. If Francis were to father a child on Mary, that child would be presented to the world as the king's son, and Francis would have handed away his own crown out of vanity. Louise made sure her son was watched. She had spent her whole life protecting that boy's inheritance, and she was not about to lose it in a bedchamber. So you have a court in which everybody's looking at one young woman calculating, and in the corner of one of those rooms a girl of about 13 was taking it all in. I want to pause on that because this is the thing I think matters most about this whole episode. Anne Boleyn's earliest experience of queenship was not a coronation, it was a surveillance operation. She watched a woman receive a crown, and then she watched everybody in the building begin quietly speculating about her body. Whether she was pregnant, whether she could be, what would happen if she was not. That was the job. That was what the crown actually meant. Nobody had to explain it to her. She was in the room. The old king lasted 82 days. Louis XII died on the 1st of January 1515, New Year's Day, and almost immediately the story began. You've probably heard the version. The old man, overexcited by his young bride, danced and feasted and kept late hours far beyond his strength, and quite simply wore himself out. He died of love. He died of her. That story was being told within days. It has been repeated for 500 years. It is in books, in films, in documentaries, and I would like to put it gently but firmly in the bin. Louis XII had been a sick man for years. He had gout. He had a recurring illness that laid him out for weeks at a time. He had been ailing long before an English princess arrived, and every ambassador in Paris knew it. Men in his condition died in that century all the time in winter, without anybody blaming a woman for it. But it makes a better story if she killed him. And here is the pattern I would ask you to watch for, because it is going to come back with a vengeance later in this tale. When something goes wrong near a woman, somebody will suggest she caused it. Not through anything she did, through what she is. Now Mary was a widow at 18 in a foreign country, and things got worse before they got better, because French custom demanded that a widowed queen be shut away for 40 days. She was moved into a darkened chamber at the Hôtel de Cluny in Paris, windows covered, candles, mourning clothes of white rather than black, which is why they called her the White Queen, 40 days of near total isolation, and the purpose of it was not grief, it was inspection. They needed to establish beyond argument whether she was carrying the late king's child, because if she was, and if it was a boy, France had a different king and Francis had nothing. So she sat in the dark and waited, and the entire political future of a kingdom waited with her. Francis came to visit, repeatedly. He was charming and solicitous, and he was also quite openly trying to find out. There are accounts of him pressing her about it, and about who she might marry next, since a widowed Queen of France with English royal blood was one of the most valuable pieces on the board. Ask yourself what those weeks were like. 18 years old, recently widowed, alone in a shuttered room, and the most powerful man in the country dropping in to ask questions about your body while pretending to offer comfort. She held her nerve, every day of it. And then she did something so audacious that it still makes me smile. Henry sent Charles Brandon to France as ambassador to bring her home. Brandon had been given explicit instructions and had made explicit promises not to do the one thing everybody was afraid he would do. Mary got him alone, and she made her case, and by her own account she told him plainly that this was the moment that if they waited for her brother's permission, it would never come, and that he would marry her now or lose her forever. They were married in secret in Paris in a small chapel in the early spring of 1515. It was technically not far from treason. Marrying a royal princess without the king's consent was not a romantic gesture. It was a crime against the crown. Henry was incandescent. Wolsey negotiated frantically, and in the end the price was staggering. The couple had to hand over Mary's entire dowry payment, return the plate and jewels she'd received in France, and pay an enormous fine, £24,000 in yearly instalments that would hang around their necks for the rest of their days. They paid it. They stayed married. So let me put the two women side by side because I think this is the heart of it. Mary Tudor got the thing almost no woman of her rank ever got. She got to choose. And she paid for that choice for 20 years in money in her brother's cooling affection in a permanent debt. And somewhere in that same household, a girl was watching and learning a lesson that would define her entire adult life. Not that a woman cannot choose. That a woman can choose if she's brave enough and quick enough and ruthless enough about her timing, and that there will be an invoice. Anne Boleyn was going to remember that. Most of the English party went home that spring. The adventure was finished. The Queen was no longer a queen, the King was buried, and there was nothing left in France for an English household. Anne did not go with them. Her father had been busy. Somewhere in the negotiations, a place had been secured for her in a different household altogether. A new queen, a quiet one, and that is where the strangest years of her childhood begin. Because for the next 7 years, Anne Boleyn lived at the centre of the most dazzling, most extravagant, most gossiped about court in Europe. And she was going to spend almost all of that time behind a locked door in the household of a young woman who was pious unwell, permanently pregnant, and utterly unlike anybody Anne had ever served before. Amboise in the valley of the Loire. A great pale chateau on a rock above the river with terraced gardens and a chapel and a tower wide enough to ride a horse up the inside of it. A place built to be seen from a long way off, and about 400 paces from the chateau gate in a modest manor house of pink brick, an old man was slowly dying. He had arrived in France in 1516 at the invitation of the king, who'd given him the house a pension and the title of first painter and engineer to the crown. He was in his 60s, his right hand no longer worked properly, and he had brought a small number of paintings with him over the Alps on the back of a mule. One of them was a portrait of a Florentine merchant's wife which he had never quite finished, and which he could not seem to let go of. His name was Leonardo da Vinci. And in the years when Anne Boleyn was a girl in that household, she was living a short walk from the Mona Lisa. Whether she ever saw it, we have no idea, Nobody wrote it down. He died there in the spring of 1519, and the paintings went into the royal collection. And that is how they ended up in Paris, where several million people a year now queue to look at one of them. I mention it because I want you to feel the scale of where this girl had landed. 6 years earlier, she'd been in a moated manor in Kent learning her letters. Now she was in the France of Francis I at the exact moment when the Italian Renaissance came north and changed European taste forever. And she was going to spend most of the next 7 years behind a door in a set of rooms so quiet and so carefully governed that visitors compared them to a religious house. Let me introduce you to her new mistress, because I think she is the most underrated woman in this entire story. Her name was Claude. She was born in 1499, daughter of the King of France and of Anne of Brittany, and she was from birth one of the richest heiresses in Europe. Brittany came to her through her mother, an entire duchy with its own parliament, its own laws, its own fleet, and centuries of stubborn independence from the French crown. That inheritance is the reason she was married at 14 to her cousin Francis. Not affection, land. France had spent generations trying to fasten Brittany permanently onto the kingdom, and Claude's body was the hinge. Physically, she had a hard time of it. Contemporaries describe her as very short and as walking with a pronounced difficulty, most likely from a curvature of the spine. She was quiet. She was devout. She was not beautiful by the standards of a court that cared enormously about beauty, and she was married to Francis I. Now, Francis was a spectacular animal, well over 6 feet tall in a century when that was extraordinary. Athletic, restless, curious, a serious patron of artists and scholars, and a man of famously large appetites in every direction. He was the most looked-at person in Europe. So picture that marriage. The most conspicuous man on the continent, and beside him a small, limping, pious young woman that nobody described without a note of pity. And now here is the number that I would like you to sit with, because when I first worked it out properly, I had to put my pen down. Claude became queen at 15. She died at 24. In those 9 years, she was pregnant 7 times. 7. Louise, Charlotte, Francis, Henry, Madeleine, Charles, Margaret, 2 of whom would become kings or queens of somewhere, most of whom she barely got to know. Do the arithmetic on that. 9 years, 7 pregnancies, she was carrying a child or recovering from one for very nearly the whole of her adult life. She was pregnant during her own coronation. She was pregnant when the court travelled and pregnant when it stopped. And then she was dead at 24, and Francis married again 5 years later, and life at court went on exactly as before. I want to say something here that I feel strongly about. We tend to skip past women like Claude. She's a footnote in her own husband's biography. When she appears in films, she is usually a plain patient background presence, and then she is gone. But Anne Boleyn served that woman for 7 years, watched her daily from a few feet away through pregnancy after pregnancy, helped dress her, sat with her in the confinement chambers, attended the churchings, was in the household when the children came and when some of them did not thrive. If you want to know where Anne Boleyn's ideas about queenship came from, they did not come from a book. They came from watching what it did to Claude. And I want to be specific about one part of that, because it is the part nobody films. When a royal woman was near her time, she went into confinement. And confinement in that century was not a phrase. It was a physical procedure. The chamber was prepared in advance. Tapestries were hung over the walls and over the windows. Keyholes were stopped up. Fresh air and daylight were believed to be dangerous, so the room was sealed and warmed and kept dim, sometimes with a single window left partly uncovered. Men were excluded entirely, including doctors, including the husband. From that point, the room belonged to women. She would go in weeks before the birth, and she would stay in that room afterwards for a month or more before a church ceremony formally returned her to ordinary life. Now multiply that by 7. Anne Boleyn spent a significant portion of her adolescence inside sealed, darkened rooms attending a young woman who was going through the most dangerous thing a woman in that century could do over and over, because a kingdom required it. She was at 15, 16, 17 years old, an experienced hand in a birthing chamber. Hold that in your mind, it becomes almost unbearable later. So what was daily life like in there? Strict. That is the word every source reaches for. Claude ran her household with a discipline that the rest of the French court found faintly amusing. The young women who served her were supervised closely. Their conduct was policed. Prayers, needlework, music, devotional texts spoken aloud, long stretches of quiet. The court of Francis I was out there, the most glittering and least restrained court in Christendom. Poets, painters, hunting parties, masks, and a circle of celebrated beauties who moved with the king wherever he went. And Claude's rooms were an island in the middle of it, doors shut, voices low, which produces the strangest fact about Anne Boleyn's adolescence, and one that almost every retelling gets exactly backwards. You will hear it said over and over that Anne Boleyn learned her arts at the licentious French court, that she came home dangerous because of what she'd absorbed there, that France taught her how to handle men. The truth is that she spent those years in what was by common agreement the most tightly governed and most morally careful household in France. She was not out there, she was in here. She could hear the party, she was not at it. And I think that is far more interesting and far more useful than the version we have been sold. Because a young woman standing at a window watching something she is not permitted to join is not learning how to behave, she is learning how it works. Now let me show you what she could see through that window. Because the court of Francis I offered a young woman exactly 2 scripts, and she watched both of them play out in full. Script 1 was Claude, the wife, honoured, crowned, respected, prayed for and consumed. Her value was her lineage and her fertility, and both were used until there was nothing left. She was not made regent when her husband went to war in Italy. That job went to his mother. Claude had the title and the womb. Somebody else had the authority. Script 2 was the mistress, and that role at that court was almost an official position. The most celebrated woman in that circle during Anne's years there was Françoise de Foix, Countess of Chateaubriand. She was clever, she was said to be an excellent poet, and for years she was the acknowledged favourite. Gifts, jewels, land influence over appointments. Her family rose with her, and then Francis grew interested in somebody younger and it ended. There is a story that came out of that court afterwards, told by a French writer a generation later. So treat it as court legend rather than documented fact. It says the king asked for his jewels back, and that Françoise, rather than simply returning them, had every piece melted down into plain gold ingots first, so that the mottos and devices he'd engraved on them were destroyed forever and sent him back the metal. If it happened, it is one of the great exits in history. But the lesson underneath the story is not funny at all. She was the most fortunate woman at that court, and when it ended, she had no rights, no standing, and nothing to appeal to. So there it is, 2 scripts. The wife used up by 24, the favourite discarded and asked for the jewellery back. Let me put the question to you directly, because I think it is the real question of this whole chapter. You're 15 years old. You're clever, you're watchful, you have no money of your own and no title. Those are your 2 options, and everybody around you accepts that these are the only 2. Which one do you pick? There was, to be fair, a third figure in that court who did not fit either script, and Anne would have seen her constantly. Louise of Savoy, the king's mother. Widowed young, she had spent decades manoeuvring to put her son on a throne that was never supposed to be his, and when he got it, she effectively governed alongside him. She was made regent of France while he was away at war. She handled finances, appointments, diplomacy. When things later went catastrophically wrong for Francis, it was Louise who held the kingdom together. So there was a woman with real executive power in that building. Actual power, not influence. But look at how she got it. She got it as a mother. Her authority ran entirely through her son. I've thought about that a great deal. Anne Boleyn grew up watching 3 models of female power, and every one of them came with a catch. Govern in your own name and give up marriage entirely. Marry and be consumed. Or rule through a man and hope he keeps needing you. That is the whole menu. In the year 1520, in the most advanced court in Europe, there was every option available to a woman with ambition. And speaking of the year 1520, in June of that year, in a valley between 2 towns in the English-held territory around Calais, something happened that people talked about for the rest of the century. The Field of the Cloth of Gold. 2 kings, Henry VIII and Francis I, met for 18 days of ceremonial friendship that was really 18 days of competitive showing off. A temporary palace was put up with real glass windows, tents of cloth of gold in their hundreds, fountains that ran with wine, thousands of horses, nobles who mortgaged estates to be there and never financially recovered. Queen Claude attended, and where Claude went, her ladies went, which means that in all probability Anne Boleyn was there. And here is the detail that gives me chills. Her father was one of the people organising the English side of it. Her mother was among the English ladies who attended. And her sister Mary, by then married to a gentleman of the King's Chamber, was almost certainly in the English party as well. So on that field in that valley you may have had the entire Boleyn family in one place for the first time in 6 years, standing on opposite sides of a diplomatic occasion. The parents and the elder daughter with the English, the younger daughter with the French. We have no letter about it, no account of a reunion. Nobody thought a 14-year-old attendant was worth writing down, but I would love to know what her mother thought seeing her, because the child who left England had barely spoken a word of French. The young woman standing across that field spoke it like a native dressed like a French woman, and moved like somebody who'd been raised in a royal household, which she had, and somewhere on that same field at some point during those 18 days she would have seen the King of England, probably from a distance, probably in a crowd, a very large man in a great deal of gold, laughing too loudly, wrestling with the King of France and losing. She was nobody. He would not have noticed her. Before we go on, one more piece of tidying, because it matters. There is an old whisper about Anne Boleyn's years in France, a claim about her reputation there which surfaces in a diplomatic letter, written more than 20 years after she had left the country, at the precise moment when destroying her family was politically useful to everybody involved. It concerned one of the Boleyn sisters, and over the centuries it has been attached to whichever one made the better story. I would simply point out the timing. Nobody said any of it while she was in France. Nobody said it when she returned. It appeared only when it was needed. We are going to keep meeting that pattern, and I want you to notice every time. So, 7 years. 7 years of quiet rooms, watchful discipline, and a mistress being slowly worn away by the job of being a queen. 7 years of a party she could hear but not attend. You might expect a girl in that position to come out of it hungry for the party. She did not, because something else was happening in those years in that same household, and it had nothing to do with jewels or kings, or which script a woman was supposed to choose. Somebody was putting books into her hands, dangerous ones. Books in French about God of a kind that could get a person into serious trouble. And the woman doing it was the king's own sister. In a library in London there is a small manuscript written in French on good paper in a professional hand. It is a collection of readings from the letters and the Gospels arranged for every week of the year. 52 weeks. A quiet, practical little book, the sort of thing a devout person keeps beside them. And on its pages there is decoration that ties it to one particular owner, a woman who was by the time it came into her possession the most watched person in England. That book belonged to Anne Boleyn. Now on the face of it, a French devotional volume is the least surprising possession imaginable for a woman of her background. Everybody had something like it, except that this particular text came out of a very specific circle of scholars in France. A circle that was within a few years of its founding being investigated, denounced, hunted, and in some cases forced to flee the country. So let me say something that I think is the single most important sentence in this whole story. The most dangerous thing that ever happened to Anne Boleyn in France was not a man. It was a paragraph, and the person who put it in front of her was almost certainly the king's sister. Her name was Marguerite of Angoulême, and later when she married a second time Queen of Navarre. She was 2 years older than Francis I, and she was, by the assessment of pretty much everybody who met her, the finest mind in the French royal family. She had Latin, Italian, Spanish, and she went after Greek and Hebrew later on because she wanted to get at older versions of the scriptures. She was also, and I love this about her, a working writer. Not a patron who commissioned things, a person who sat down and produced them. She wrote poetry, she wrote devotional verse of real seriousness, and she wrote a collection of stories published after her death which borrowed its shape from Boccaccio and filled it with something quite different. 70-odd tales, many of them told by women, a striking number of them concerning women who have to outwit men who will not take no for an answer. That is not a courtly amusement. That is a woman using fiction to say something about her own world. Her personal life was for years unhappy. She'd been married off at 17 to a duke who was brave enough on a battlefield and had almost nothing else to recommend him. There was no companionship in it and no children, and she poured that unspent energy into two things: her brother's interests and the life of the mind. Now here is where it gets dangerous. Around the year 1521, a bishop named Guillaume Briconnet took charge of the Diocese of Meaux, a town outside Paris, and decided to do something unusual with it. He invited scholars in. He gathered a group of the most serious biblical thinkers in France and gave them a place to work and preach. The most important of them was an elderly humanist named Jacques Lefebvre d'Etaples. And what Lefebvre wanted was not a revolution. He would have been appalled by the word. What he wanted was accuracy. He had spent his life going back to the oldest versions of the biblical texts he could find, comparing them and noticing with growing discomfort that a good deal of what people had been taught for centuries did not quite match what was actually on the page. And in 1523 he did the thing that changed everything. He published the New Testament in French, not in Latin, in the language people spoke in the street. Marguerite protected all of it. She corresponded with the Bishop of Meaux for years, hundreds of letters back and forth about the state of her soul and the state of the church. She sheltered these men when the mood turned. She used her position over and over to stand between scholars and the people who wanted them silenced. Stop and think about why a translation would be considered dangerous. If scripture exists only in Latin, then access to it runs through an educated professional, a priest, and that man decides what it says and what it means and what you ought to do about it. Put the same text into French or into English and something quite different happens. A person can sit in their own chamber with the book on their knees and form their own view. Now apply that to a woman, because this is the part that I think gets consistently underplayed. Women were shut out of the universities. Women could not take holy orders. Women were not permitted to preach or to teach in public. Every formal route to religious authority had a lock on it, but nobody had thought to forbid a woman from having a book in her own language. The vernacular scripture was for women of that generation an unlocked side door in a building where every other entrance was bolted. It let them go directly to the source. It let them form opinions they had not been handed. And I would put it to you that this, and not the fashion and not the dancing and not the accent, is the truly consequential thing Anne Boleyn brought back from France. She came home believing that a person could go and look for themselves. Let me be honest with you about the timeline, because this is where a lot of retellings get sloppy, and I would rather not. The circle at Meaux was only getting going in the last year or so of Anne's time in France. She was recalled at the end of 1521. The French New Testament came out after she had gone. The crackdown came later still. So we cannot draw a straight line and say that a teenage Anne Boleyn sat at the feet of these men and absorbed their teaching. What we can say is this: she spent her formative years inside the household circle of the woman who was the single greatest protector of that movement in France. She was in the environment where these questions were burning and urgent and being argued over by people at the very top of the kingdom. And she came out of it with a permanent appetite for French devotional writing of exactly that flavour which she kept feeding for the rest of her life. The books in her possession are not the books of a woman who picked up a passing fashion. They are the books of somebody who kept up. There was a second manuscript, a French poem presented to her years later, which speaks of a child expected soon and the hopes attached to that birth. It is a beautiful thing, and the point is that people who wanted to reach her knew exactly what kind of book she would welcome. Word had got round. If you wanted the ear of the Queen of England, you brought her French evangelical writing. Now let me tell you what happened to the people who wrote it so that we are clear about the stakes. In 1525, while the King of France was out of the country in circumstances we will not go into here, the authorities in Paris moved against the reformers at Meaux. The theologians of the university had been furious for years. The circle was broken up. Books were condemned. Lefebvre, by now an old man, left the country. Others were arrested. Some who followed the same path in the years afterwards were put to death for it. Marguerite did what she could. She sheltered scholars on her own lands. She wrote letters. She used her brother. And then they came for her too. In 1533, the theology faculty in Paris put her own devotional poem, a work about the soul's relationship with God, onto a list of condemned books. Her poem, the King's Sister's poem, Francis I was informed, and he reacted the way you might expect a proud man to react when a committee of academics insults his family in public. The university was made to explain itself at length, and then to take it back. But look at what that moment tells you. Even a princess of the blood, protected by an adoring brother who happened to be the king, could be dragged onto a censure list for writing about her own faith. That is the world Anne Boleyn's religious education came out of. Not a gentle seminar, a place where the wrong book on your shelf could end you. Before we go further, 2 corrections, because this is territory where people get things badly wrong in both directions. The first, Anne Boleyn was not a Protestant. That word barely existed in the sense we use it, and it does not describe her. She attended Mass. She believed in the sacrament. She was, in the language of her own time, an evangelical, somebody who wanted scripture available in the common tongue, who was hostile to what she saw as superstition and profiteering within the church, and who wanted reform from the inside rather than a break. The second correction cuts the other way. There is a school of thought that says her religion was pure calculation, that she took up reform because it happened to suit a woman who needed the church's authority weakened. I do not buy it, and here is why. Look at what she did with her patronage. She promoted reforming clergy relentlessly. Several of the men she pushed forward became the leading churchmen of the next generation. Her own chaplains included the man who would one day, under her daughter, shape the church of an entire nation. And in the last days of her life, she asked that same chaplain to take care of her daughter's spiritual welfare. That is not a political maneuver. Nobody stages a deathbed request for the benefit of an audience that does not exist. Her almoner kept accounts. Her charitable giving was substantial, and it was consistent year after year, and much of it went where reformers said it should go into the relief of the poor rather than into ornament. People do not fake that for a decade. There is one more piece of evidence, and it is my favourite because it shows you exactly what she did with a book once she had one. Years later, when she was already the most talked about woman in England, a copy of a banned English work came into her hands. It argued, among other things, that a king answers to God alone, and not to any churchman in Rome, and simply owning it could land a person in very serious trouble. Anne lent it to one of her ladies. It was seen taken away and carried straight to the cardinal, which is exactly the outcome you would expect and exactly the sort of thing that ended careers. Most people in her position would have gone quiet and denied everything. She went to the king, she asked for her property back, got it, and then rather than putting it away, she marked the passages she wanted him to notice and handed it to him, and he looked through it. And by the account that has come down to us, he said it was a book for him and for all kings. Think about the nerve of that. She took a book that could have destroyed her and turned it into the thing that made her indispensable. That is not a woman with a decorative interest in theology. That is somebody who understood that a book placed in the right hands at the right moment is a lever. And now the part of this story that I have been waiting to tell you. Marguerite's devotional poem, the one the theologians tried to condemn, was about a soul aware of its own failings and reaching for mercy anyway. It was published in French in the early 1530s, at exactly the time Anne was at the height of her influence in England. In the year 1544, a girl of 11 sat down and translated that poem out of French and into English. She did the work herself. She then embroidered the cover of the little book with her own hands in blue silk and silver thread, and gave it as a New Year's gift to her stepmother. Her name was Elizabeth, and she was 2 years and 8 months old when her mother was taken from her. She had no memory of her. There were no portraits on the wall, no anniversaries kept, no stories told out loud, because the subject was not a safe one in her father's house. So how does an 11-year-old girl with no living connection to her mother end up choosing that specific text by that specific French author out of every book available to her? I want to be careful. We cannot prove Anne owned a copy. Nobody wrote a note saying this belonged to my mother, but something passed down that line. The taste for it, the language, the particular flavour of French devotional writing that Anne had loved since she was a girl in the Loire Valley. Servants' talk. Women who had served Anne were still around, and some of them served Elizabeth. A woman in France wrote it. A young English woman abroad learned to love that kind of book. Her daughter, who never knew her, translated it at 11 and stitched the cover herself. 3 women, 2 countries, 3 generations, 1 thin book. If you want to know what Anne Boleyn actually left her daughter, forget the jewels and the badge and the portraits. It was a reading habit. And I would like to ask you something since we are here in the quiet part of the night. Was there a book that arrived in your life at exactly the right age? Not the greatest book you have ever come across. The one that turned up when you were young enough for it to rearrange the furniture in your head. Most of us have one, and most of us can name the person who put it there. Anne was about 20 when the letter arrived recalling her to England. She had left as a child who could not order a meal in French. She was coming back with an accent nobody could place, a set of opinions about the church that would have alarmed her grandmother, and a way of carrying herself that had been learned in the households of 3 formidable women. She was in every way that mattered a foreigner, and she was about to discover that the country she had been so carefully prepared for had absolutely no idea what to do with her. Start with a piece of headwear, which sounds like a strange place to begin, and I promise you it is not. In England, in the early 1520s, a respectable woman of good family wore what was called a gable hood. Picture a stiff, pointed, box-like structure, rather like the front of a house, hence the name. It sat forward on the head. It was heavy. It was lined and wired and weighted, and its function above everything else was to cover every single strand of a woman's hair. In France, women had moved on to something else. A crescent-shaped hood set back on the head, curved light and considerably more comfortable. And it showed the hair. Not a great deal of it. A band of it at the front framing the face. That is the entire difference. A few inches of visible hair. Now, if you have ever wondered how a society signals what it expects from women, look at what it puts on their heads and pay attention to what it insists on hiding. Because when Anne Boleyn came back to England, she came back wearing the French one. The recall came at the end of the year 1521, The reason was, as always, arithmetic between kingdoms. England had spent the autumn quietly changing sides. Cardinal Wolsey had been at Calais for months, ostensibly mediating a peace, actually negotiating an alliance with the Emperor. By the time the year turned, England and France were sliding toward open hostility, which meant that an English gentlewoman serving in the household of the Queen of France was now at best awkward, at worst a liability, so a letter went out, and a young woman of about 21 who had lived abroad since childhood, who had served 2 queens and a regent, and who had not seen her own country in 7 years, packed up her life and came home across the Channel. But there was a second reason, and this one is a great deal more interesting because it very nearly rewrote English history before it started. They were bringing her home to marry her to an Irishman. Stay with me because the tangle here is delicious. Anne's grandmother on her father's side had been a butler, one of the 2 daughters of the Earl of Ormond. Ormond was one of the great titles of Ireland with enormous estates attached, and when the old earl died without a son, his lands passed by law to his daughters, which made Thomas Boleyn through his mother a co-heir to an Irish earldom. There was, of course, a rival, a butler cousin named Piers, who was on the ground in Ireland, who had the loyalty of the family's followers, and who simply took the title and started using it. Possession as ever being most of the law. Now the English crown had a problem. It needed Piers Butler Cooperative because governing Ireland without the butlers was next to impossible. It also had a nobleman at court with a legitimate legal claim to the same title, and that nobleman was becoming very useful indeed. So somebody, and the correspondence suggests it was Anne's own uncle who first proposed it, came up with the obvious 16th century solution: marry the 2 claims together. Piers Butler had a son James, who was conveniently already in England, attached to Cardinal Wolsey's household. Thomas Boleyn had a daughter of the right age currently sitting in France where she was no longer welcome. Bring the girl home, marry her to the boy, the claims merge, the king gets peace in Ireland and everybody's honour is intact. The king himself took an interest. Wolsey handled the details. And I want to stop here and let this land properly because I do not think most people have ever considered it. If that marriage had gone ahead, Anne Boleyn would have spent her life in Ireland. She would have been the Countess of Ormond in a castle at Kilkenny running estates and raising butler children. There is no Reformation Parliament. There is no break with Rome in the form it took. There is no Elizabeth. The entire history of England and a fair chunk of the history of the world hung for a while on a property dispute about Irish land. So what happened? Why did it fall apart? The honest answer is that we do not fully know, and anybody who tells you otherwise is filling in a gap. The negotiations dragged, then they stalled, then they quietly stopped being mentioned. The likeliest explanation is money. Thomas Boleyn does not seem to have been willing to hand over his claim on the terms offered, and a marriage settlement in that century was a contract before it was anything else. 2 lawyers failing to agree is a far duller reason than romance, and it is usually the correct one. It was resolved years later by a different route entirely when Piers Butler was persuaded to give up the Ormond title in exchange for another one, and Thomas Boleyn took the earldom himself. By then, of course, everything had changed. But here is the part of this I find quietly sad. Nobody at any point in those negotiations appears to have asked Anne anything. She'd been shipped out at 12 and shipped home at 21, and the plan on her return was to ship her onward to a country she had never seen to marry a man she had probably never met. That was not cruelty, that was a Tuesday. Now, what was it actually like, that homecoming? I think this is one of the most underexplored moments in her whole story, and it is the one I suspect a lot of you will recognise from your own experience. She had left England as a child who could barely order a meal in French. She came back speaking French so naturally that a French observer who knew her later wrote that you would never have taken her for an English woman. Sit with that. She was English. She had been born in England, her whole family was English, and she'd become so thoroughly formed by another country that her own countrymen heard something foreign in her. Her clothes were wrong by English standards. Her hood, as we said, sat back where an English hood sat forward. Her sleeves were cut differently. Her whole silhouette announced from across a room that she had come from somewhere else. And I would love to know how that was received in the first few weeks, because we can see the ending of the story, even if we cannot see the beginning. Within a decade, the French hood was everywhere at the English court. The stiff gable version became the mark of an older woman or a conservative one, or a woman making a point. Fashion is never only fashion. It is a vote taken quietly by everybody in the room. Her manner was wrong too. The French court had a conversational style that English observers found startling in women. Quick, playful, argumentative in a light way. Women there were expected to hold their own in company with men, to make a joke, to return a compliment with an edge on it. In England, that same behaviour got a different name. Bold, forward. And her English, after 7 years away, would have been rusty at the edges. The idioms had shifted. The court slang was new. Everybody she had known as a child was 7 years older, and had spent those 7 years building relationships she had no part in. Have you ever done this? Come home after years somewhere else and found that home had carried on without you, that the shape you used to fit in had quietly filled in. There is a specific loneliness in that. You are not a foreigner. You are worse than a foreigner. You're supposed to belong and you do not, and nobody can quite say why. But I want to argue something, and it is the argument at the centre of this whole chapter. Being the outsider was the single greatest advantage she ever had. Every other woman in that court had grown up inside its assumptions. They had absorbed the rules so early that the rules had become invisible to them. That is how a culture works. It stops looking like a set of choices and starts looking like reality. Anne had spent her formative years somewhere else. She could see the English court from the outside the way you can only see a room when you've just walked into it. She knew the rules were rules, not laws of nature, rules made by people. And a person who knows that about the world they inhabit is a very different proposition from a person who does not. Her formal introduction to that world came in the first week of March in the year 1522. The occasion was Shrovetide, and Cardinal Wolsey was entertaining imperial ambassadors at York Place, his enormous London residence. The diplomacy being celebrated was the new alliance with the Emperor, which is to say, an alliance against France. Let that irony settle for a moment. Anne Boleyn's debut at the English court took place at a party thrown to celebrate turning on the country that had raised her. The chronicler Edward Hall left us a description of the evening, and it is wonderful. At one end of the great chamber they had built a castle. 3 towers painted green, decorated with green foil so it caught the torchlight. Banners flying from each tower. Wax torches everywhere, 32 to a branch, and the whole thing glowing. Inside the castle were 8 ladies, each one costumed as a virtue with the name of her virtue embroidered in gold on her headdress. White satin, gold caps, Milan bonnets. Beauty was played by Mary Tudor, the king's sister, the former Queen of France, who by then had been married to Charles Brandon for 7 years and had paid a great deal of money for the privilege. Kindness was played by Mary Boleyn. Constancy was played by Jane Parker, who would in a few years marry into the Boleyn family and whose story ends about as darkly as any in this century. And Perseverance was played by Anne. Guarding the castle were 8 more performers in costume playing the qualities that keep lovers apart. Danger, disdain, jealousy, scorn, unkindness, strangeness, and one whose name translates roughly as sharp tongue, which I think is the finest character name in the history of English court entertainment, and ought to be revived immediately. Then 8 lords attacked the castle, led by a figure called Ardent Desire. The ladies defended it by throwing rose water and sugared sweets down at the attackers. The attackers threw dates and oranges back. The vices fled, the virtues surrendered, and everybody danced, and afterwards they took off their masks and had supper. Now you have almost certainly seen this scene on television, and in every version I have come across, this is the moment. The king's eyes meet Anne's across the torchlight. The music swells. History begins. I have to take that away from you, and I am sorry. There is no evidence for it. None. The king was at that pageant. Anne was at that pageant. That is the entirety of what we know. Nobody wrote down that he noticed her, and nobody at the time behaved as though anything had happened. The first solid evidence of a relationship between them comes around 4 years later, and in the spring of 1522 the Boleyn sister the king had his eye on was by every serious account the other one. There is one small detail from that same Shrovetide that people love to point at. At the jousting, the king rode out with a motto embroidered on his horse's trappings, declaring that a lady had hurt his heart with a picture of a pierced heart alongside it. It gets quoted constantly as though we know who it referred to. We do not. It was a courtly convention. Half the men in the list rode under mottos like that. It is the 16th century equivalent of a vague, moody message posted publicly at midnight, and treating it as evidence tells you more about us than about him. What we do know is what happened next, and it is far more interesting than a glance across a room. Anne Boleyn was appointed a maid of honour to the Queen of England, Catherine of Aragon, 36 years old, a Spanish princess who'd been in England for 20 years. Devout, dignified, formidably intelligent, and by that point carrying a grief that had become the central fact of the kingdom. She had been pregnant many times. One child had survived, a daughter. And here is where I need you to look at the pattern, because I think it is the single most important thing in this young woman's entire education, and almost nobody puts it together. By the age of 21, Anne Boleyn had personally served 3 queens. She'd watched Mary Tudor be married off to a dying king isolated in a foreign country and shut in a darkened room for 40 days while a kingdom waited to inspect the result. She'd watched Claude of France carry 7 children in 9 years and die at 24, and now she was pinning the sleeves and carrying the prayer books of Catherine of Aragon, a woman whose entire standing had been slowly dismantled by pregnancies that ended badly. 3 queens, 3 crowns, 3 women whose worth in the end was measured by one thing. She had a clearer view of what a crown actually costs a woman than almost anyone alive in England. Remember that. Because in a few years she's going to reach for one anyway, and when people call that ambition or foolishness or vanity, I would ask them to explain how a woman who had seen all of that could possibly have been under any illusions. She knew exactly what she was walking into, which makes what she did next either the bravest thing in this story or the most reckless. And I have gone back and forth on that for years. But before any of that, before kings and crowns and any of the rest of it, something else happened in those queen's chambers. Something small, something ordinary, something that happens to young people in every century and every country. A young man kept finding reasons to be in the room. He was the heir to one of the greatest earldoms in the north of England, and he was in Cardinal Wolsey's service, and he came to the Queen's apartments often. And he began quite openly to pay attention to one particular attendant, and for the first time in her entire life at the age of about 22, Anne Boleyn was given something she had never once been offered, a choice. A long gallery in a great house in London, winter light through the windows, and a young man being taken apart in public. He is Henry Percy, heir to one of the oldest earldoms in England. He is somewhere around 20 years old, and he is standing in front of Cardinal Wolsey, who is the second most powerful man in the kingdom, while the household servants stand along the walls and pretend to be busy. One of those servants was a man named George Cavendish, who served the cardinal for years and who wrote it all down decades later. He is our witness for what happened next, and I will come back to how much we should trust him. The cardinal, according to Cavendish, told the young man that he had behaved foolishly, that he had entangled himself with a girl at court and that his father had other plans for him, and that the whole business would now be undone. And then Wolsey said the thing that I suspect Anne Boleyn never in her life forgave. He referred to her in front of a room full of servants as a foolish girl. Now, let us find out what these two young people had actually done. Percy was in Wolsey's household, which was standard for young noblemen. It was a finishing school with better food. And whenever the cardinal attended the king, his young gentleman would drift into the queen's apartments to talk with the ladies, because that is what young men have always done and always will, and Percy fell in love. Cavendish says there grew such a secret affection between them that they became, in his phrase, insured together, intending to marry. That word matters enormously, insured, because in the church law of that century, a promise of marriage exchanged between two consenting adults was not a hopeful conversation. If they spoke the words in the present tense before witnesses, that was a binding contract. It did not require a priest. It did not require a ceremony. It was for practical purposes a marriage. And when Wolsey ordered him to break it off, Percy did something that has always made me like him. He argued back. He said he was of good years and able to provide for her. He said she came of good stock. And he said that he had gone so far before witnesses that he did not know how to withdraw from it with a clear conscience. He was, in other words, telling the second most powerful man in England that it was too late. It was not too late. His father was sent for. The old earl came down from the north and gave his son a public dressing down in that same gallery in front of those same servants, calling him a proud and presumptuous waster, and reminding him that he had a spare brother if needed. Percy folded, anyone would have. He was married off to Mary Talbot, daughter of the Earl of Shrewsbury, in a match arranged entirely without either of them. That marriage was a disaster. It was miserable from the start, and it stayed miserable. And here is where it turns from a sad little story into something with teeth. Because years later, when Anne Boleyn had become the most important woman in England, Percy's wife made a claim. She said her own marriage was not lawful because her husband had been contracted to Anne Boleyn first. Think about what that meant. If it were true, Anne's marriage to the King of England was worthless. Every promise, every fight, every year of it, undone by a conversation between two young people in a corner of the Queen's chamber. Percy was summoned. He swore on the sacrament in front of the archbishops that there had never been any contract. He was made to swear it again later when they came looking for reasons. And in the spring of 1536, Henry Percy sat as one of the peers at Anne Boleyn's trial. He was ill by then. During the proceedings, he collapsed and had to be carried out of the hall. He died a little over a year afterwards. So how much of Cavendish should we believe he wrote 30 years later? He adored Wolsey and wanted him remembered kindly. And he knew when he was writing exactly how the story ended, which has a way of tidying up a person's memories. What I would say is this. He was in the building. He had no reason to invent a betrothal that made his beloved cardinal look cruel. And the pre-contract claim resurfaced twice afterwards from people who had nothing to do with him. Something happened in that chamber. I am satisfied of that much. And if you want my personal view, and this is only mine, I think it was the one moment in her whole life when Anne Boleyn tried to make an ordinary choice. Not a strategy, not a placement. A young woman and a young man deciding they liked each other. She lost. And she was made to lose in public, and to hear herself described as a foolish girl by a man in a red hat. I do not think she ever quite got over it. There was another young man in her orbit around that time, and his name has become permanently attached to hers. Thomas Wyatt. He grew up at Allington Castle in Kent, which is a comfortable ride from Hever. The two families knew each other. He was a couple of years younger than her, or a couple of years older, depending on which birth date you favour. And he was one of the finest poets England produced in that century. He brought the sonnet into English almost single-handed. He was also married unhappily and separated from his wife. There is a poem of his that everybody quotes. It describes a hunt and an exhausted hunter who has given up the chase because the creature he is pursuing wears a collar around its neck. And engraved on that collar are words warning everyone away, saying that she belongs to Caesar, and that although she may look tame, she is not. Wyatt borrowed the frame of that poem from an Italian original, but the collar and Caesar and the weariness are all his own additions. It has been taken as being about Anne for 400 years. It may be. Poets write about more than one woman, and a wise reader keeps that in mind. But the timing fits, and so does the tone, which is not the tone of a man in love so much as a man who has understood that he has lost. His grandson, writing many years later, gathered up family stories and testimony from old women who had served Anne and passed on a scene that is too good not to mention, with the warning that it comes to us second hand across 2 generations. The story goes that Wyatt took a small jewel that hung from her pocket on a lace and kept it, and that some time afterwards, playing at bowls with the king, there was a dispute about a shot. Henry pointed at the mark with a finger, and on that finger was a ring he had taken from Anne, and he said more than once that the cast was his, and Wyatt, who could see exactly what the king was showing him, said he would measure it, and pulled out the jewel on its lace to measure the distance. Henry recognized it instantly. He said something to the effect that if it was so, then he had been deceived, and he walked off the green and the game was over. Whether it happened exactly like that, I could not tell you. But somebody in that family remembered a story about 2 men and a piece of jewellery, and I find it hard to believe it was invented out of nothing. Wyatt was arrested in 1536. He was one of the very few in that circle who came out of the Tower alive, most likely because his father had powerful friends. He wrote about what he witnessed from his window there, and the lines are among the most haunted things in the language. He said the sight stuck in his head night and day. Now let us deal with the lies, because Anne Boleyn is buried under more invented detail than almost any woman in English history, and I want to hand her back to you as she actually was. Start with the one everybody knows, the 6th finger. That story comes from a book published in 1585. Its author was a Catholic exile named Nicholas Sander. He wrote that Anne had a projecting tooth, a large growth under her chin, which she hid with high collars and 6 fingers on one hand. Here is what you need to know about him. Sander was about 6 years old when Anne Boleyn died. He never met her. He never saw her. He was writing nearly 50 years after the fact from abroad as part of a campaign to discredit the English Church and the Queen, then sitting on the throne, who happened to be Anne's daughter. In the same book, he claims Anne was secretly the king's own child, which would have been quite the arrangement given that Henry VIII was in France at the time she would have had to be conceived. That is the source, one hostile author half a century late with a case to make. So what did people who actually looked at her say? A Venetian diplomat writing in 1532 gave a description that is almost brutally frank. He said she was not one of the handsomest women in the world, middling height, dark complexion in a century that prized pale skin, a long neck, a wide mouth, not much figure to speak of. And then right at the end, almost against his will, he adds that her eyes were black and beautiful and that she knew perfectly well what to do with them. A French visitor a few years later described her as elegant and said her eyes were the most attractive thing about her. That is a real woman, not a beauty by the fashion of her time and quite aware of it, who had spent her whole life learning that the way to hold a room is not to be the prettiest person in it. There is even an honest note about her hands which I love because it shows how a small truth becomes a monstrous lie. The Wyatt family account admits there were tiny imperfections and mentions something like the beginning of an extra nail on one finger which she covered with the tip of another. A small nail, not a 6th finger. And in the 1870s, when restoration work was carried out at the chapel in the Tower, and the burials beneath it were examined, the remains believed to be hers were looked at by a doctor. He described a woman of delicate build in her late 20s or early 30s, and noted nothing unusual about the hands or the spine at all. Then there is the witchcraft. You will hear it said that Anne Boleyn was accused of witchcraft. She was not. It appears nowhere in the charges against her. What exists is a single passing remark reported second-hand by a hostile ambassador, in which the king grumbled that he'd been drawn in by charms. That is a man making an excuse. It is not an accusation, and it is certainly not a trial. But it stuck, because a woman who rises that far must have used something other than her own qualities. That is the rule, and it has never really gone away. So let us come back to where we started and answer the question properly. What was it like growing up as Anne Boleyn? It was being born into a family, climbing out of a hole and understanding early that you were part of the rope. It was being loved and appraised in the same breath by parents who saw no contradiction in that at all. It was watching babies arrive and not all of them stay. It was being handed a curriculum designed to make you attractive, useful and quietly working out which parts of it were weapons. It was being put on a ship at 12 and taken out of your own country, and then put on another ship and another, always at somebody else's convenience and never once being asked. It was serving 3 of the most remarkable women in Europe, and learning 3 different lessons about power, each of them with a hook in it. It was standing in a shuttered room while a kingdom waited to find out what a young woman's body would produce. 7 times. It was falling in love once briefly and being publicly humiliated for it. And it was at the very end of all that preparation coming home to a country that had absolutely no idea what to do with a young woman who spoke like a French woman, argued like a scholar, and would not lower her eyes. Here is what has stayed with me through all of it. Every single thing that made Anne Boleyn extraordinary was later itemized against her. The French-Polish became foreignness. The wit became insolence. The confidence became pride. The books became heresy. The training in how to hold a room became in the mouths of her enemies something far uglier. They built her, and then they charged her with being what they had built. And still, consider this. The little girl who was sent away, who was never consulted about anything, whose entire childhood was arranged by other people, produced a daughter who ruled England for 44 years, never married anybody, answered to no man alive, and gave her name to the whole age. The time will come, she wrote in her prayer book, when she was young and nobody was paying attention. She was wrong about herself. She was right about her daughter. Thank you for staying with me tonight and for giving these hours to a girl who spent most of her childhood being talked about and almost never listened to. If you take one thing away, let it be this. Before she was a queen, before she was a scandal, before she was a legend and a warning and a ghost story, she was a child in a cold house in Kent, learning her letters with no idea what any of it was for. There is more of this story ahead. There is the long, strange 6-year courtship that nobody planned and nobody could stop. There is a king who would break with Rome rather than be told no, and there is the crown itself and what it cost her to wear it. Rest well, sleep gently, and when you are ready, come back and we will carry on.